There is a kind of silence that belongs only to large houses in the late hours of the night. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a house that has settled into itself, that has breathed through its long day and arrived at last at stillness. The fire in the grate has gone to coals. The lamps on the lower floors have been turned down one by hands that do this every evening without thinking much about it. Somewhere upstairs a clock marks the quarter hour, and the sound travels down through the walls of the house and into the parlour where a woman sits alone. She has been sitting for some time. There is paper on the writing desk beside her, and a pen, and an inkwell whose cap she has already removed, which means she has been thinking about writing for longer than she has been writing. The address she's going to write at the top of the page is not the address of a friend or a cousin. It is the address of an office in a commercial district of the city, an office that keeps no sign outside, an office that depends for its livelihood on the quality of its discretion. She is going to hire a detective. She's going to hire a detective to watch her own family. Outside the windows of the house, the city breathes its nighttime breath. Inside, she picks up the pen. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. There is a particular quality to the rooms that wealthy women inhabited in the last decades of the 19th century in America, and it is worth spending some time inside one of those rooms before the story begins moving, because the rooms themselves are part of the story, and because attending to a room, to its textures and its proportions and the way the light falls across its surfaces in the evening, is its own kind of preparation for understanding the lives that were lived inside it. The parlour of a house on Fifth Avenue in New York in 1885, or on Beacon Street in Boston, or on Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, was a room designed to communicate certain things to the people who entered it. It communicated stability. It communicated taste, which in that era and in that world meant a specific kind of European-inflected aesthetic literacy that had been cultivated over generations. It communicated wealth, but wealth of the kind that had been present long enough to become something more settled than wealth, to become what people in those houses called position. The furniture was heavy and dark and polished to the kind of sheen that accumulates over years of careful attention. The carpets were thick and absorbed the sound of footsteps, so that movement through the room was nearly silent. The curtains were lined and fell in long, unbroken folds from ceiling to floor, and when they were drawn in the evenings, they gave the room a quality of enclosure, of separateness from the city outside. That was part of what those rooms were designed to provide. There were flowers, usually, in the autumn months cut from hothouses that the house maintained for exactly this purpose. In spring and summer, there were flowers from the garden, arranged by hands that had arranged flowers in this house for 15 or 20 years and knew exactly how they should look. There were books on shelves that had been built into the walls, and paintings in heavy gilt frames, and small objects on the mantelpiece and on the side tables that had stories attached to them, stories of travel and inheritance and gift-giving that connected the objects to specific moments in the family's history. A woman who sat in one of these rooms in the early evening, in the hour between dinner and the various obligations that might claim the later evening, was sitting inside a very particular kind of life. The room told you what you were. It told you where you stood. It told you, if you were the kind of woman who thought carefully about such things, exactly what you had and exactly how it was held and exactly who, in the final legal analysis, it belonged to. Because that was the other thing that rooms like this communicated if you read them carefully enough. They communicated that the stability and the taste and the position were held under terms. The terms were not written anywhere in the room. They did not need to be. They were written into the law and into the custom and into the understanding of everyone who moved through those rooms, including the woman herself, who had been learning to read those terms since she was old enough to learn anything. The terms were these: the wealth that had built this room, that maintained this room, that filled this room with its dark furniture and its thick carpets and its carefully arranged flowers, had been made by men, and was managed by men, and would pass in the ordinary course of events to men. The woman who sat in the room was the beneficiary of the wealth in a particular and limited sense. She lived well because of it. She was educated and dressed and housed and fed by it. She moved through a social world that recognized her as a person of standing because of it. But she did not own it in the way that would have allowed her to direct it according to her own judgment. She could not decide to sell the house if she concluded that a smaller one would serve her better. She could not invest in a business she thought promising. She could not leave money to the people and causes she cared most about without the approval of the men who administered whatever trust or arrangement governed her access to the family's resources. She was, in the legal language of the era, a femme covert, a woman covered, in the sense that her legal identity was subsumed into the identity of her husband if she was married, or into the identity of her father or brother or trustee if she was not. She existed legally at a slight remove from full personhood, and the room she sat in, beautiful as it was in some deep structural sense not entirely hers. Some women in these rooms had made their peace with this arrangement. They had found within it a domain of genuine authority and genuine satisfaction, the management of a household, the raising of children, the navigation of the social world that was, in its way, as complex and demanding as any business. They were not fools or passive victims. They had made a rational assessment of the options available to them and had chosen the most promising available path. But some had not made that peace. Some sat in the parlour in the evening and felt the terms of the arrangement with a clarity that the beautiful room was not quite able to obscure. These were the women who had been paying careful attention to the machinery of the system they were inside, not just participating in it but watching it, learning how it worked, noting where its gears turned and where its levers were and where. If you looked long enough and carefully enough, there were places where the machinery might be worked differently than it was designed to be worked. These were the women who, in the late 1880s and the 1890s and the first years of the new century, began writing letters to addresses in commercial districts, addresses above doors that opened into offices where discreet men with careful records and trained eyes and extensive professional networks could be retained for a fee to find out things that other people were trying to keep hidden. They were going to hire detectives. They were going to hire detectives to watch their own families. And the information those detectives brought back was going to change everything. The evening in the parlour had a particular texture in autumn. The fire was well established by this hour, built up by the housemaid after dinner, and now burning with the steady, even warmth that a good fire reaches when it has been going for some time and no longer needs tending. The light it gave was amber and moved slightly, not with the agitation of a young fire, but with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, the coals shifting now and then with a soft sound, a small settling, a brief brightening, and then the return to the steady glow. The woman at the writing desk could feel the warmth of the fire on the right side of her face. Outside the curtained windows, which she had not opened this evening though she sometimes did, the city was doing whatever the city did in the late hours of an autumn evening in the 1880s, its carriages and its gas lamps and its particular urban sounds, muffled by the glass and the curtains and the thickness of the walls into something that was more like a sense of presence than an actual sound. Inside, the room smelled of the fire and of the flowers in the vase on the mantelpiece, chrysanthemums, which had a dry, slightly resinous scent that she associated with this time of year, and faintly of the dinner that had been eaten some hours ago, the last traces of warmth and food that settle into the fabric of a room and linger past the evening itself. She had been thinking about the letter for 3 weeks. She had been thinking, in some form, about the situation the letter was meant to address for considerably longer than that. Years, perhaps. The thinking had changed over the years, had shifted from the diffuse, unformed anxiety of early suspicion to something more precise and more purposeful, as she had accumulated information about what the specific problem was and what, if anything, could be done about it. The problem was not one she could easily describe to anyone in her social circle. It was not the kind of problem that her world had a language for, or at least not a language that could be spoken aloud in a parlour conversation without creating exactly the kind of scene that would make everything worse. It was the kind of problem that lived in ledger books, and in conversations held in rooms she was not invited into, and in the gap between what she was told was happening with the money that was legally hers and what she suspected with increasing certainty was actually happening. She had been told many times in many different registers that she did not need to concern herself with these matters. That was what she had lawyers for. That was what she had trustees for. That was what she had, in the earlier years of all this, a father for, and before that, a grandfather, and now brothers. The men of the family had always managed the money and had always done so capably, and would continue to do so, and her role was to live well on the income it produced, and not to worry about mechanisms she had no real need to understand. She had spent a long time believing this, or behaving as though she believed it. which is not quite the same thing. She no longer believed it now. What she believed now, based on a careful accumulation of small evidence over several years, was that the money that was supposed to be managed in her interests was being managed in other interests, and that the men who were supposed to be her trustees and her lawyers were operating in practice as part of a system that ran in directions she'd not authorized and that would not serve her well if she did not find a way to change it. The change required information, specific, documented, actionable information that she could take to her own lawyer, a lawyer she'd found herself rather than being assigned, and use as the basis for a legal intervention that would put the situation on terms she actually agreed to. Getting that information was the problem. She could not get it herself. She did not have access to the offices and the clubs and the banking institutions where the conversations were happening. She did not have the professional relationships with the clerks and the accountants and the assistants who processed the relevant transactions. She did not have the trained eye that could look at a set of financial records and see not just what they said, but what they were shaped to conceal. But someone did. The address she was going to write at the top of the page had been given to her by a woman she trusted, a woman who had used these same services 2 years ago for reasons she had explained in the careful, general terms that their social world required, and who had told her, afterward, that it had made the difference between a bad outcome and a manageable one. She picked up the pen. The ink was fresh, the nib was good, the paper was her own, cream-coloured and heavy, with no letterhead because this was not a letter that should have her letterhead on it. She wrote the address, then the date, then the salutation. Then she paused for a moment, listening to the house around her, the clock ticking somewhere above, the fire settling into its slow work, the curtains barely moving in the draught from somewhere she had never entirely identified, and then she began. The letter she wrote that evening was careful and precise, and said exactly what she needed to say, without saying anything that did not need to be said. She had been composing it for 3 weeks. It came out almost exactly as she had composed it. She folded it when it was done, and addressed the envelope and sealed it, and set it on the silver tray on the hall table, where the outgoing post was collected every morning. Then she went upstairs to bed. The house was quiet around her as she climbed the stairs. The fire in the parlour would burn itself down to ash before morning. The letter on the hall table would leave the house with the morning's other correspondence. The detective agency on the other side of that address would receive it and read it, and send someone to acknowledge receipt and discuss terms. And the watching would begin. The word that the era used for what these women were was heiress, and the word carried in its sound and in its social meaning a quality of brightness, of fortune literally embodied, of a woman whose position in the world was elevated and visible and envied. An heiress was a woman with a fortune attached to her name. She moved through rooms with the particular quality of attention that money creates around its possessors. She was noticed when she entered and noted when she left. But the word heiress also had a legal meaning, and the legal meaning was somewhat different from the social one. The legal meaning was this: a woman who had inherited, or was expected to inherit, a significant fortune was a woman who stood at the centre of a set of financial and legal arrangements whose complexity was inversely proportional to the control she actually exercised over them. The fortune was real. Her access to it was conditional. The conditions were set by men. The legal framework that governed the lives of these women in the 1880s and 1890s was old enough to feel like nature. It had been built over centuries of English and then American common law into a structure that was so thoroughly embedded in the way the world was organised that most people who operated within it had never had occasion to question whether it was right, only to learn how it worked and to work within it accordingly. The framework had a name: coverture. The doctrine of coverture held that when a woman married, her legal identity merged into her husband's. She ceased to exist as a separate legal person in any meaningful sense. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not bring a lawsuit or be the defendant in one. She could not earn wages that belonged to her rather than to her husband. She could not receive an inheritance and keep it for herself. She could not, in the eyes of the law, make any of the fundamental financial decisions that constituted the management of a life. All of these capacities passed by operation of law at the moment of marriage to the man she married. What she had was his. What she earned was his. What was given to her was his. What she inherited on the day after the wedding was his as completely as if she had handed it to him in a box. This was the world that these women lived in, and before you can understand why they hired detectives, it is necessary to sit with what that world was like. Not abstractly, not in the legal terms that describe it from the outside, but from inside the experience of a woman who was intelligent and capable, and fully aware of what was happening to her, and who had been told since she could understand words that the correct response to this situation was acceptance. Imagine a woman, a specific woman, whose grandfather had made a significant fortune in the years after the Civil War in one of the industries that the industrial expansion of that era had made profitable: coal, or railroads, or steel, or manufacturing. Something that involved the application of capital to the extraction or transformation of natural resources on a large scale. The fortune had grown over the decades, had been managed by her grandfather and then by her father, and had reached the level at which it required professional administration. Lawyers, accountants, trust companies, investment advisors, the whole apparatus of institutional wealth management. She had grown up inside this fortune without exactly understanding it. It was the water she swam in. It was expressed in the quality of her house, and the number of the servants and the schools she attended, and the clothes she wore and the people she knew. She understood in a general way that the family had money, understood it the way that people understand things that have always been true about the world they inhabit, as a background condition rather than as something that required examination. Then her father died, or her grandfather died, or some event in the family's history caused the question of who exactly controlled the fortune, and on what terms, to come to the foreground from the background where it had always quietly lived. And she began, perhaps for the first time with real attention, to look at the arrangements. What she found, when she looked, was often not what she had imagined. She had imagined, in the vague way that people imagine things they have not had occasion to think about carefully, that the fortune was more or less hers, that it was being managed on her behalf by capable professionals whose interest was to serve her interests, that the income she received was roughly what the investment of the fortune's capital should be expected to produce, that the arrangements her father or grandfather had made were arrangements that expressed their intention to provide for her. What she found sometimes was that all of this was true in a formal sense and quite differently arranged in practice. The trustees who were supposed to manage the trust for her benefit were people who had their own financial interests in the management of the assets. The lawyers who were supposed to advise her were people who had been retained by the family, meaning by the male members of the family, for a long time and who understood their primary loyalty accordingly. The investment decisions that were being made were investment decisions that made sense in the context of the broader financial interests of the family as a whole, which was not the same thing as investment decisions that maximised the income to her trust. And in some cases, what she found was considerably more direct than this. Brothers who were borrowing against expected inheritances that had not yet been received, using instruments that relied on her assets as implicit collateral in ways she had not been asked about. Trustees who were redirecting trust income into ventures that benefited their own portfolios. Lawyers who were preparing legal documents, competency petitions or trust modification applications that were presented to her as routine administrative matters but that, read carefully, would have significantly reduced her practical control over the assets that were legally hers. The system was not designed to be malicious. That is worth saying clearly because understanding it requires understanding not just what it did but what it was. It was a system designed for a world in which the assumption of female incapacity with money was so thorough that it had been built into the legal and financial infrastructure at every level. The lawyers and trustees and bankers who operated within it were mostly not deliberately planning to harm the women whose fortunes they managed. They were operating according to the assumptions of their world, which included the assumption that a woman who had concerns about her financial arrangements was probably either confused or anxious or unreasonably suspicious of people who were acting in her best interest. The men who told her she did not need to worry about this were not in most cases lying. They believed she did not need to worry. They believed that they were managing her affairs competently and that her interests were being served. What they did not believe, what the system had never asked them to believe, was that her judgment about her own interests was as reliable as their judgment about her interests. She was a woman. They were professionals. The question was not one that required her input. This was the world, And into this world, in the 1880s and 1890s, the detective agency arrived as a specific and useful tool. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been founded by a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton in Chicago in 1850, and by the 1880s it had become the largest private law enforcement organization in the world. With more agents than the United States Army had soldiers, its reputation had been built on railroad security and on the intelligence work it had done for the Union Army during the Civil War, and it had expanded in the post-war decades into a general detective and investigation business whose clients included corporations, insurance companies, and private individuals. But the Pinkerton Agency, large and famous as it was not the only detective service available to wealthy women with financial problems. In the cities where these women lived, New York and Boston and Philadelphia and Chicago, there were smaller agencies, less famous, maintained by former police officers or former Pinkerton men who had set up independent practices and who had built their own client networks through exactly the kind of word-of-mouth recommendation that operated below the level of the formal directories. These smaller agencies had advantages that the large national firm did not always offer. They were more flexible. They were in some cases more willing to take on the particular kind of case that a wealthy woman brought to them, cases that required discretion about the client's identity as well as about the subject of the investigation, cases that might not produce dramatic outcomes but that served the client's interest in ways that a purely transactional assessment might have dismissed as insufficiently conclusive. And they had, in some cases, developed particular expertise in exactly this kind of case. Because the woman who hired them was not, as it turned out, unique. She was one of many. The pattern she represented was a pattern, which meant that the men who dealt with these cases regularly came to understand its grammar, came to recognize the specific constellation of circumstances that brought a woman to the address above the unmarked door, came to know what questions to ask and what kinds of evidence mattered, and what the information they gathered was likely to be used for. This expertise was itself valuable, not just the information that any investigation produced, but the framework for understanding what the information meant, what it implied, what it would allow in the legal and social context where it would eventually need to function. A woman who came to a detective agency in the 1880s with a vague sense that something was wrong with her financial arrangements, and left with a specific documented account of exactly what was wrong and what evidence existed and what could be done about it, was a fundamentally different person from the woman who had arrived. She was a person with information. In the world she moved in, information was power, and power was what the system she was inside had been designed to prevent her from having. The letter on the hall table was the beginning of getting it back. The fortune that she was trying to protect let her sit for a moment with what it actually consisted of, because the abstraction of wealth needs to be given some texture to be understood. In the 1880s, a significant inherited fortune in the American wealthy class might be worth somewhere between $200,000 and $2 million in the bank accounts and trust instruments and property holdings that constituted its capital. The income from such a fortune, invested in the bonds and real estate and dividend-paying stocks that were the standard instruments of conservative wealth management in that era, might run to somewhere between $8,000 and $20,000 per year. This was, by any standard of the era, a great deal of money. The average industrial worker in 1885 earned somewhere between $400 and $600 per year. A skilled professional, a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer, might earn between $1,500 and $3,000. A woman's independent income of $10,000 per year placed her in a financial position that very few people in America occupied. It was also, and this is the thing that needs to be held alongside the first thing, a great deal of money that was subject to management by people who were not her, and that she could lose access to in specific ways and under specific conditions that she might not know about until after the fact. The conditions varied by case. Some women had trusts that were well structured and honestly managed and that served their interests as the trustees claimed. Some had trusts that were structured with gaps that allowed for the kind of ambient management in the interests of others that accumulated over years into something significant. And some had arrangements that were, beneath their formally correct services, operating in ways that amounted to a quiet and ongoing transfer of wealth from the woman whose name was on the trust documents to the men who managed it. The detective work was about finding out which situation she was actually in. It was about moving from the general anxiety that something was wrong to the specific knowledge of what was wrong. which was the only knowledge that could be acted on. The evening in the parlour had been the beginning of that movement. The letter on the hall table was the next step. And somewhere in a commercial district of the city, in an office that kept no sign outside, a man was going to read that letter in the morning and begin the work of finding out what she needed to know. The fire in the parlour had burned down to ash by the time the house fell entirely silent. The letter on the hall table was still there, waiting for the morning's collection, still sealed, carrying inside it the beginning of a different kind of story than the one the house had been designed to tell. The office was on the second floor of a building in Lower Manhattan, in one of the streets that ran down toward the financial district, and it had the quality of an office that had been established in that location for some time, and had arranged itself over the years into a configuration that was efficient without being deliberately welcoming. There was a reception room with 2 chairs and a small table, maintained at a temperature that was comfortable in the winter, and somewhat less so in the summer, but not so uncomfortable that anyone lingered unnecessarily. Beyond the reception room was a larger office, the working office, where the man who ran the agency spent the hours between 9 in the morning and whatever time the evening's work required him to be somewhere else. His name was Edward Harrington, and he had been running the Harrington Investigation Bureau for 9 years by the time of the events in this story. He had come to the work by a route that was common enough in his era. He had been a police detective for 8 years, working in the precincts of Lower Manhattan and then in the Detective Bureau, learning the geography of the city's criminal life and its commercial life, and the places where those 2 geographies overlapped in ways that were legally complicated and professionally interesting. He had left the police force not because of any single incident, but because of an accumulation of small frustrations with the limitations of what the force could do and would do in the kinds of cases that interested him most. The police were equipped and authorized to respond to certain kinds of events, crimes that were visible and definable, and that produced a specific kind of victim and a specific kind of perpetrator. They were much less equipped to address the other kind of financial harm, the slow, ambient, structurally permitted harm that was done to people not through dramatic criminal acts, but through the ordinary operation of legal mechanisms that had been designed to allow it. He found the independent work more interesting. He found it, in some ways, more useful. And he found, over the years of running the agency, that the cases that came to him from women had a particular quality that he had learned to recognize and respect. The women who came to him had almost always been thinking about their problem for a long time before they came. They had almost always already tried the approaches that the social world prescribed, the conversations with trustees and lawyers and family members that were supposed to resolve these matters within the family and without external intervention. They had tried those approaches and found them inadequate, and they had arrived at his office because they had concluded that the inadequacy was not incidental but structural, that the system they were asking to police itself was not going to do so. They were right. That was usually his first private assessment before the investigation had confirmed anything, that the woman sitting across the desk from him was right about the general shape of the problem. The investigation was about the specifics. He kept 2 ledgers. The billing ledger was kept by his assistant, a methodical woman named Pauline, who handled the administrative side of the business with the kind of systematic attention to detail that the work required. The private ledger was kept by Harrington himself, and it was a different kind of document. The private ledger was where he recorded patterns, not the specific facts of individual cases, which were kept in separate case files, but the things he had noticed that seemed to repeat across cases, the recurring structures and dynamics and strategies that told him something about the system these women were navigating. He had been adding to this ledger for years, and it had become, over time, a kind of manual for understanding the particular kind of financial predation that wealthy women were subject to. What the private ledger showed, read as a whole, was that the specific cases were variations on a small number of underlying patterns. The first pattern was the trust administration problem. A woman had a trust. The trust was managed by a trustee who had some connection to the male members of her family, either through professional relationship or social connection or both. Over time, the management of the trust drifted from the terms the trust's creator had intended toward an administration that served the trustee's interests and the interests of the male family members more than the interest of the trust's beneficiary. This drift was rarely dramatic. It was almost never a single clear act of theft. It was a long, slow accumulation of small deviations, each defensible on its own, that added up over years to something significant. The second pattern was the competency preparation. A woman with a fortune had family members, usually brothers or male cousins, who had an interest in establishing legal control over that fortune. The legal mechanism for establishing such control was the competency proceeding, in which a court could be asked to declare a person mentally incapable of managing their own affairs and to appoint a guardian who would manage those affairs on their behalf. The preparation for such a proceeding happened typically months or years before the proceeding itself was filed. Physicians were cultivated, social narratives were established, evidence of eccentricity or instability was collected and shaped into a pattern that would support a legal argument. The third pattern was what he thought of as the inheritance intercept. An older relative, a parent or grandparent, was in the process of dying or updating their estate documents, and the male members of the family were working to ensure that the final documents reflected a division of assets that favoured them. This could involve direct influence on the dying relative, or it could involve working through the lawyers who were drafting the documents, or it could involve a combination of social pressure and legal mechanism that was difficult to identify as a single thing, but that consistently produced outcomes that directed wealth away from female family members and toward male ones. These three patterns and their combinations and variations covered the great majority of the cases that came to him from women. He had seen enough of them to be able, within the first conversation, to place a new case within the general pattern it most resembled and to know what kinds of evidence would be useful and where to look for them. The woman who came to him in September of 1888 had sent a letter first, a careful letter that described the general outlines of her situation, without giving the kind of specifics that she did not want committed to paper. He had written back, proposing a meeting at the office at a time of her choosing. She had replied with a date and an hour. She had arrived precisely on time, dressed in the dark clothes that the era required of women in her social position, who were conducting business, and she had sat down in the chair across from his desk and told him, in measured and consecutive language, what was happening. He listened without interrupting. This was a practice he had developed over the years because he had found that the pattern of what a person said, the sequence of the facts they chose to introduce, and the order in which they introduced them, told him almost as much as the content of what they said. The pattern revealed what the person thought was most important, which was not always the thing that turned out to be most important, but it was useful data about where their attention was and where the blind spots might be. She was in her early 40s, he estimated, and she had the quality of someone who had been intelligent for a long time and had learned to apply that intelligence within the particular constraints that her world imposed on intelligent women. The intelligence was visible in the precision of her language and in the way she anticipated his likely questions and addressed them in advance. The constraint was visible in what she did not say, in the places where the narrative became slightly more general, slightly more careful, in the way she described the family dynamics, without naming specific people with the kind of explicit accusation that could, if the letter had gone to the wrong person, have been used against her. Her situation was a variation on the second pattern, the competency preparation. Her brothers, she told him, had been for some time engaged in a systematic campaign to establish a social narrative of her instability. This campaign had taken several forms. There had been conversations at family gatherings in which her judgment had been gently questioned, comments made in the presence of people outside the family that established a picture of a woman who was erratic or excessively anxious or given to decisions that reflected poorly on her rational faculties. There had been, she believed, conversations with her physician, a doctor who had been the family's physician for many years and who understood his loyalty accordingly. She did not know the specific shape of what was being prepared. She did not know whether a legal proceeding had already been contemplated or whether the campaign was still in its preliminary stages. She did not know who had been engaged to support it, what physicians had been approached, what lawyers had been retained. What she needed to know was exactly that. Not in the general sense of suspicion that she already had, but in the specific sense of documented fact that would allow her and her own lawyers to prepare a response before the proceeding was filed rather than after. He asked her the questions he always asked. How long had she been aware of the situation? What specific incidents had led her to the conclusion she had reached? What, if any, contacts had she already had with lawyers or other advisers about the matter? What her financial arrangements were, specifically the structure of the trust that held the assets at issue? She answered all of them. The answers were organised and detailed and internally consistent, which was one of the things he noted in the private ledger. The consistency of these women's accounts, the way that their narratives held together under questioning in a way that narratives founded on anxiety rather than observation usually did not. He told her his fee and the terms of his engagement. She agreed without negotiation, which was also something he noted. The directness with which these women did business, the absence of the performative hesitation that the era expected from women in commercial transactions. She left. He opened a case file. He wrote the case number in the private ledger alongside a few characterizing observations. The investigation that followed took 11 weeks. What it found is best understood by the method used to find it, because the method itself tells something about the particular nature of this kind of evidence and about how it was assembled into something useful. Harrington employed 3 approaches that he had developed and refined over the years of working these cases. The first was document research, conducted through his connections in the legal and financial world, the network of clerks and assistants and junior professionals who processed the paper that wealth generates, and who had, in some cases, been providing him with information for years on the basis of relationships that combined the professional and the personal in ways that were difficult to categorize precisely. The second was physical surveillance, which he used selectively and with an attention to the specific social geography of the world his subjects moved in. Not the crude surveillance of following people down streets, though that was sometimes necessary, but the more refined surveillance of knowing where conversations happened and placing someone at the edge of those conversations, in the peripheral positions that high society always required, the serving staff and the coachmen and the club employees who moved through the spaces where wealthy men conducted their informal business. The third was the cultivation of sources within the professional networks that the subjects relied on. Lawyers' offices had junior staff who were not bound by the same professional constraints as the lawyers themselves. Trust companies had employees who processed documents and who, in some cases, had already been troubled by what they were seeing and were looking for an appropriate way to address it. Banks had tellers and clerks who were attuned to the patterns in their clients' accounts and who could be prompted gently to articulate what they had noticed. None of this was dramatic. All of it was slow. It required patience of a specific kind, the patience of someone who was assembling a picture from many small pieces and who knew that the picture would not become visible until enough pieces were in place. What it produced at the end of 11 weeks was a report. The report was a document of some 20 pages, handwritten in the careful script that Harrington used for documents that were going to leave his office in his client's possession, and it described what the investigation had found in a specific, factual, sourced way that distinguished clearly between what was documented and what was inferred and what was still uncertain. What was documented was this. Her eldest brother had met with the physician, Dr. Thomas Caldwell, 3 times in the preceding 4 months, at Caldwell's office rather than at a social setting, which suggested business rather than friendship. Caldwell was not the woman's physician, but had a connection to the family through the eldest brother's own medical history. The brother had also retained a lawyer, one Walter Greer of the firm Greer & Saunders, who specialised in estate and competency matters. What was inferred, on the basis of the documentary evidence and the physical surveillance, was that the brother was in the early stages of preparing a competency proceeding. The meetings with Caldwell had the character of the cultivation process that typically preceded such proceedings. The retention of Greer, whose practice was almost entirely in this area, had no other obvious explanation. What was still uncertain was the timeline, when the proceeding might be filed, whether the other brother was involved, whether the physician who had been the woman's own doctor had been approached. She read the report in his office, in the same chair she'd sat in during their first meeting, with the same quality of concentrated attention that she had brought to that first conversation. She read it all the way through without asking questions. Then she read the section on the physician again. Then she asked him to find out about her own doctor. He did. The investigation took another 3 weeks. What it found was that Dr. Thomas Caldwell had had a conversation with Dr. James Morris, the woman's physician, at a dinner at their mutual club approximately 6 weeks prior. The conversation had lasted about 20 minutes. Neither man had recorded what was said, but a club employee who had been attending to a table near theirs and who had been in a position to hear fragments of the conversation recalled that it had been about a patient, a woman patient, and had involved Dr. Morris expressing what he described as certain professional concerns. She received this information on a Thursday afternoon. By the following Tuesday, she'd retained a new physician, a recommendation from a woman she trusted who had personal reasons to understand why the choice mattered. She had also arranged for that new physician to conduct a full and thorough examination and to produce a detailed written assessment of her mental and physical health, an assessment that was organised explicitly as documentation against a potential competency challenge. By the following Thursday, she had given a copy of this assessment to her lawyers, along with the investigation reports, and the lawyers had begun preparing the legal response. The competency proceeding was filed 6 weeks later. The response was already prepared. The proceeding failed. He added the case to the private ledger with a note about the method and a notation about the timeline between the investigation's first findings and the legal response. He was building from these cases a kind of practical guide to the process. Not a guide he would publish or distribute, a guide he would use in the next case and the one after that. Because there would be a next case. There always was. The office on Fulton Street received its letters and its visitors in the long, slow rhythm of a business that existed to solve a particular kind of problem for a particular kind of client, and the clients kept coming because the problem kept existing. The system that produced the problem was old and deeply embedded, and was not, in the 1880s or the 1890s or the early years of the new century, going to change on its own. What was changing was the number of women who knew what they were facing, and the number of women who had decided, sitting alone in a parlour in the late hours of the evening, watching the fire burn down, that they were going to do something about it. One letter at a time. In the summer of 1891, a woman named Lavinia Whitmore arrived at a law firm on Lower Broadway that had been recommended to her by another woman whose situation she had heard about through the careful, partially encoded network of information that wealthy women in this era maintained about matters that they could not discuss openly, but needed to discuss somehow. She had not gone to a detective agency first, as some women did. She had gone first to her family's lawyer, who had managed her affairs since her father's death, and then to a second lawyer, who had been suggested as a more objective perspective, and then, after finding both of those conversations inadequate in ways that had made her increasingly certain that the inadequacy was not accidental, she had come here. The law firm she had arrived at was that of Charlotte Vance, one of the handful of women who had managed, through sustained persistence and considerable legal ability, to be admitted to the New York bar and to build a practice there. Vance had chosen to build that practice in the areas where the demand was most real and least served, which meant the areas where women's financial interests were at stake and where the existing legal resources were either unavailable or unreliable. Lavinia told her story in the careful and organised way that women of her generation and position had learned to present the most complex and emotionally charged material, with a surface of control over an interior of great anxiety. Her father had died in 1872 when Lavinia was 31. He had left her an inheritance through a trust, a principal of $200,000, to be invested and managed by a trustee, with the income from the investment to be paid to Lavinia quarterly for the remainder of her life. The trustee he had named was a cousin named Robert Ashby. Ashby had legal training and a reputation for sound judgment, and her father had known him for 30 years and trusted him accordingly. Lavinia had not been consulted in the choice. She had not been consulted in the terms of the trust. These were decisions made by her father in the same spirit in which her father had made most decisions about her life, with genuine care for her welfare and a thorough, unconsidered assumption that his judgment about what that welfare required was more reliable than her own. For the first several years after her father's death, the trust had functioned as it was supposed to function. The quarterly income payments arrived on time. They were what she had been told to expect. Ashby communicated with her occasionally about the trust's investments in a general and reassuring way, and she had read his communications with the general, an accepting attention of someone for whom the specific financial mechanisms involved were not familiar territory. Then gradually things had begun to be not quite right. The first sign was the income. In the spring quarter of 1878, the payment she received was slightly lower than it had been in the preceding quarters. Not dramatically lower. Low enough that she noticed, but not low enough that she felt confident calling it a problem rather than a normal variation. Ashby's explanation when she asked was market conditions, a phrase that was technically informative and practically opaque, and that she had accepted because she did not have the knowledge to evaluate it. Over the following years, similar variations occurred. Sometimes the income was what it should be, sometimes it was slightly less. The pattern was irregular enough that no single quarter constituted obvious evidence of a problem, and the explanations when she asked for them were always plausible. What had changed in her approach to the situation, the thing that had eventually brought her to Charlotte Vance's office, was that she had spent the better part of 3 years educating herself about trust administration and investment management in ways that went considerably beyond what a woman of her class and era was expected to know about financial matters. She had done this by reading. Not the general reading that was respectable for a woman of her position, the novels and the periodicals and the histories. She had read financial papers and legal digests and the annual reports that trust companies published, and the assessments of investment performance that appeared in the commercial press. She had read these materials carefully, and she had asked questions of people who would not be alarmed by the questions, and she had built, over those 3 years, a working understanding of what trust administration was supposed to look like, and how to assess whether what she was being told was consistent with what should be happening. It was not consistent, that was what she had concluded. The income she had been receiving over the past several years was lower than the investment of her trust's principal in conservative instruments should have produced. Not dramatically lower, not in any single year, but consistently lower in a way that, when she added up the shortfall across the years, was substantial. She had also concluded that the quarterly statements Ashby was providing were summary documents that gave her the end results without the transactional detail from which those results derived, and that when she had asked for the full transactional records, the provision of those records had been delayed and incomplete in ways that had begun to feel like obstruction, rather than administrative difficulty. Charlotte Vance listened to all of this. She asked questions, the specific kind of questions that a lawyer asks when they are assessing whether what they are hearing constitutes a legal problem or merely a personal grievance, and the answers satisfied her that this was the former. She recommended a detective agency. Not for the surveillance of Ashby, which would have been expensive and might not produce the kind of evidence that mattered, but for a specific kind of financial document investigation, the reconstruction of the trust's actual investment history from sources other than the records Ashby had provided. The investigation that followed was conducted over the course of 4 months by a team of investigators who specialized in exactly this kind of financial document work. They approached the problem from multiple angles simultaneously. They traced the trust's investments through the banks and brokerage houses that would have processed the relevant transactions. They examined the property records that would reflect any real estate holdings the trust had acquired or disposed of. They identified the counterparties to the trust's investments and followed those connections into the financial world where they led. What they found, assembled piece by piece over those 4 months, was a picture that differed from the one Ashby had presented in several specific and documentable ways. The first difference was the fee structure. Ashby had been paying himself as trustee fees for his services that were significantly higher than the standard for trust administration in this period, fees that had been established by a provision in the trust documents that was technically valid, but that had not been explained to Lavinia at the time and that she had not known to question. The second difference was the investment decisions. Over a period of several years, Ashby had moved a significant portion of the trust's capital out of the conservative instruments her father had specified and into ventures that were more speculative and that had, in a number of cases, produced poor returns. The ventures were not random. Several of them had a common characteristic. They were ventures in which Ashby himself had an interest, either directly or through business relationships that the investigation traced with some care. The third difference was the most significant. In the course of examining the trust transaction history, the investigators found evidence that in 1885, Ashby had transferred a sum of approximately $40,000 from the trust into a private investment account under his own name. The transfer had been recorded in the trust's internal documents as a temporary loan, with a note indicating that it would be repaid. 5 years later, there was no record of repayment. Lavinia received the investigation report at Charlotte Vance's office. She read it in the same room where she had first described her situation, with the same quality of attention that she had brought to every stage of this process. She asked questions that were specific and that demonstrated that she understood precisely what she was reading and what it meant. Then she asked what could be done. What could be done was this: a petition to the court for an accounting of the trust's management and for the removal of the trustee. The petition would lay out the documented evidence of the fee overcharges and the self-interested investments and the undisclosed transfer. It would ask the court to require Ashby to account for every transaction in the trust's history and to return whatever the accounting showed had been taken or improperly charged. The case that followed was not quick. Ashby contested the petition, as he had every right to do, and produced his own lawyers and his own accountants, who presented the trust's history in the most favourable possible light. The proceedings took place over several months and involved testimony from both sides and extended examination of documentary evidence. But the documentary evidence was what it was. The investigators had done their work thoroughly. The records they had assembled from sources that Ashby had not known to obscure told a story that was not easy to reframe. The fee overcharges were documented to the dollar. The self-interested investments could be traced through the public records of the ventures involved. The transfer of $40,000 was recorded in the trust's own internal documents. The court removed Ashby as trustee and appointed an independent institutional trustee in his place. It ordered a full accounting of the trust's history. The accounting revealed that the total amount of money that had been improperly removed from the trust over the course of its administration was somewhat higher than the investigation had initially estimated. The recovery was not complete. Some of the investment losses that had resulted from Ashby's self-interested decisions could not be attributed to recoverable misconduct under the legal standards of the time. But the trust was now under independent management, and the income from that management, paid in full and on time in every subsequent quarter, was what it should have been from the beginning. Lavinia Whitmore continued to receive that income for the remainder of her long life. She died in 1916 at the age of 75. She had designated the trust principal, in the terms of her own carefully drafted will, to a fund for the support of women pursuing legal education. Charlotte Vance, who had been her lawyer through the proceeding and had remained in some form of contact in the years that followed, attended a small gathering held after Lavinia's death. She noted afterward that Lavinia had spoken of the investigation many times over the years, not with bitterness but with the particular clear-eyed satisfaction of someone who had done a difficult thing correctly and had received from the doing of it something that was not simply the legal outcome, but also the much less quantifiable, but equally real outcome of knowing that she had not been wrong and had not been passive, and had not accepted what was happening to her simply because the system told her she should. She had needed information. She had gotten it. She had used it. Everything that followed had depended on that. The investigators who worked these cases in the Gilded Age were practitioners of a particular kind of reading, and it is worth understanding what that reading consisted of, because the skill is more interesting and more demanding than the word watching might suggest. Watching, as a professional practice, has its own grammar. It has its conventions for what counts as evidence and what counts as speculation, and what occupies the complicated middle ground between those two things that experienced investigators call inference. And in the cases involving wealthy women and their families, the relevant grammar was one that had been developed specifically for a social world that was, in certain ways, unusually legible, and in other ways, unusually opaque. The world of Gilded Age New York or Boston or Philadelphia was legible in the sense that it was highly mapped. It was a world in which everyone who mattered, in the sense that the world itself defined mattering, was known to everyone else who mattered, and their movements and associations and activities were tracked and noted and discussed in the extensive social communications infrastructure that the era maintained. The society columns of the newspapers tracked who went where and with whom. The club records noted attendance. The dinner party guest lists circulated. The charitable committee memberships were published. This visibility was a fact of life for the people who lived inside this world, and they managed it with the practiced attention of people who had grown up understanding that being seen correctly was part of the work of living. They understood what presence at certain events communicated and what absence communicated, and they calibrated their social performances accordingly. An investigator who understood this world, who could read its social texts with the same fluency that its participants read them, could extract from the observable social behaviour of a trustee, or a brother or a lawyer, a significant amount of information about what was happening in the parts of their life that were not observable. Because the observable and the unobservable were connected. The patterns of who someone dined with, and who they met at their club, and which lawyers they retained, and which physicians they consulted, were patterns that reflected the patterns of their professional life, and the professional life was what the investigation was ultimately about. Physical surveillance of the direct and obvious kind, following a person through the streets of the city to see where they went and who they met, was a tool, but not usually the primary one. The primary tool was the reading of the secondary documents. The secondary documents were the records that accumulated around significant financial activity as a natural byproduct of that activity. When a trustee made an investment, the transaction left records at the brokerage house that processed it, at the bank that settled it, at the company or instrument that was the subject of the investment, in the property records if real estate was involved, in the corporate filings if a business was. When a lawyer filed a legal document, the document became a public record. When a loan was made or a debt was incurred, there were instruments that recorded it, instruments that had to be filed or recorded in various official ways to be enforceable. None of these secondary documents was individually secret. They existed in public offices or in the records of institutions that processed the relevant transactions, and they were accessible, in principle, to anyone who knew where to look and how to ask. In practice, they were accessible primarily to people who had the professional relationships and the technical knowledge that made asking possible, which is why the investigators who had built those relationships and developed that knowledge were so useful. Reading these documents required understanding not just what each one said, but what each one meant in context, what it implied when read alongside the other documents in the accumulating record of a person's financial activity. A single investment in a particular venture might mean nothing. The same investment, made by a trustee on behalf of a trust beneficiary, in a venture in which the trustee himself had a significant financial interest, in the context of a pattern of similar investments over several years, meant something quite specific. This reading was the work. It was slow and methodical, and not dramatic in the way that dramatic detective work is dramatized. There were no confrontations, no sudden revelations, no moments of theatrical exposure. There was the patient accumulation of documented facts and the careful construction of the pattern those facts formed, and there was the final assembly of that pattern into a document that a client and her lawyers could use. The women who received these documents were themselves capable of reading them. This was something the investigators who worked with them consistently noted. These were women who had been paying attention to their situations for years, who had been doing their own patient research within the limits of what was accessible to them, and who brought to the reading of the investigation reports a preparation and a focused intelligence that allowed them to understand quickly and precisely what they were looking at. The preparation they brought was partly intellectual. They had learned, many of them, more about trust administration and investment management, and the specific legal mechanisms relevant to their situations than their social world would have thought appropriate or necessary for them to know. They had done this learning quietly, without advertising it, because advertising it would have made them seem threatening to the very people they needed information from. But the preparation was also something more than intellectual. It was the preparation of women who had been living inside a situation for years, and who had developed, through that long habitation, a kind of embodied knowledge of its texture and its rhythms and its anomalies. They knew when something was wrong the way that people who have lived in a house for a long time know when something in the house is wrong, not through any single diagnostic observation, but through the accumulated sensitivity of long familiarity. What the investigation provided was the specific documentable version of what they already knew in that more intuitive way. It converted the felt knowledge into documented knowledge, the sense that something was happening into the evidence of what was happening, the anxiety into the ground for action. The uses to which these women put the information they received were various and often subtle. The most obvious use was legal, taking the documented evidence to their lawyers and using it as the basis for a formal legal intervention, a petition for removal of a trustee or a challenge to a legal filing or a response to a competency proceeding. This was what the investigations were, in theory, designed to produce. But the information also served other purposes that were not, strictly speaking, legal in nature, but that were in their own way powerful. One of these purposes was the renegotiation of informal arrangements. A woman who had evidence that her trustee had been managing her trust in ways that served his interest rather than hers was in a position to have a very different conversation with that trustee than the conversation she had been having before the investigation. She was in a position to make clear, without necessarily being explicit about the evidence she possessed, that she was more informed about the situation than she had previously appeared to be, and that the continuation of the informal arrangement depended on its terms being adjusted. This kind of renegotiation often happened without any formal legal process at all. The trustee, understanding that the situation had changed, would make adjustments. The fee would be reduced, the self-interested investments would be unwound, the reporting would become more complete and more timely. The accommodation would be reached quietly and without the public exposure that a formal proceeding would have entailed. Both parties had reasons to prefer this outcome. The trustee preferred it because the formal proceeding would have been damaging in ways that the quiet adjustment was not. The woman preferred it in many cases because the formal proceeding, even when it succeeded, was expensive and time-consuming and publicly exposing in ways that the adjustment was not. The information was leverage, not just evidence. And leverage, in the negotiating culture of the Gilded Age as in any negotiating culture, could produce outcomes without the explicit exercise of whatever power it represented. Another purpose the information served was the preparation of the woman's own legal instruments. A woman who knew, precisely and specifically, what the vulnerabilities in her current arrangements were could design her own instruments, her own will, her own trusts, her own powers of attorney, to close those vulnerabilities. She could build, from the detailed knowledge of how the system could be used against her, a set of legal structures that were specifically designed to resist those uses. This was, in some ways, the most durable outcome of the investigations. The legal structures that these women built, informed by the specific documented knowledge of how the system operated in practice, rather than in theory, were more robust than the structures they would have built without that knowledge. They anticipated the specific maneuvers that had been used in their cases and in similar cases. They closed the gaps that those maneuvers had exploited. They created, in some instances, precedent-setting arrangements that other lawyers then used as models. The watching was teaching. What was learned in the act of watching was the specific practical mechanics of the system, and what was done with that learning was the construction of defences that the system had not anticipated, because the system had not anticipated that the women being watched would watch back. The fire in the parlour had burned down to its steady coals. The investigator across the desk was writing notes in his careful hand. The woman in the chair was reading the page he had prepared, reading it with the complete and focused attention of someone who had been waiting a long time to see this information, and now had it in front of her. Outside the curtained window of the office on Fulton Street, the city went about its afternoon business, its carriages and its commerce and its particular afternoon sounds, all of it happening in the world that was simultaneously the world these women moved in and the world that had for so long moved without them. That was changing now. One case at a time, one report at a time, one woman in one chair reading one document with the complete attention of someone who knows, finally, exactly what she's dealing with and exactly what she's going to do about it. The watching had come full circle. They had been watched for all of this time, their movements and associations and activities noted and recorded in the social communications infrastructure of their world, their choices subject to interpretation by people whose interpretations they could not control, their lives conducted under the constant implicit supervision of a social world that regarded them as objects of scrutiny rather than subjects of their own experience. Now they were watching back, and what they were learning in those offices and from those reports was going to prove to be considerably more useful than anything that had been learned about them. Equity 6, the case of Eleanor Van Cortlandt. The woman who arrived at the office on Fulton Street in the autumn of 1893 was not young, but she was not, in the way that the era defined these things, old. She was 53. She had been a widow for 8 years. She had 2 sons and a daughter, and she had managed, in the years since her husband's death, the estate he had left her with a competence that was not in question among the people who had any real opportunity to observe it. Her name was Eleanor Van Cortlandt, and she had been brought to the office not by a letter but in person, by a friend whose own experience with the agency had convinced her that this was the correct resource for the situation Eleanor had described. The situation Eleanor described was this. Her younger son, whose name was William, had begun approximately 8 months ago to circulate a narrative about his mother's health and mental state that was, in Eleanor's assessment, carefully constructed rather than spontaneously offered. The narrative described her as increasingly forgetful, as easily confused in matters of business, as showing signs of the kind of cognitive decline that, in the language of the era, would have suggested to anyone who heard it that a competency question might, at some future point, need to be raised. The narrative was being delivered quietly, in the social context where such things are delivered, in conversations at club dinners and at the drawing room visits that constituted the social infrastructure of their world, in the kind of aside that sounds like concern rather than strategy, but that has the strategic character that concern does not. Eleanor had heard reports of this narrative from 3 different sources, which meant she had heard the part that travelled back to her, which meant that the part that did not travel back to her was likely considerably larger. Her elder son, whose name was Frederick, had not, to her knowledge, been participating in this campaign. But he had also not been visibly resisting it, and his silence in the face of what his brother was doing was something that Eleanor, who knew both her sons very well, read as a kind of passive participation. Her daughter was sympathetic but frightened of her brothers, and had told Eleanor, in the particular way that people tell you something and also tell you not to do anything about it, that the situation had progressed further than Eleanor might realise. Eleanor wanted to know how far it had progressed. She wanted to know whether William had already consulted lawyers. She wanted to know whether he had approached any physician with a view to obtaining the kind of professional assessment that a competency petition would require. She wanted to know the specific shape of what was coming so that she could prepare for it properly. She described all of this with the particular clarity of a woman who's been living with a frightening situation for long enough that the fear has been somewhat transformed by familiarity into something more useful, something more closely resembling tactical planning. He told her what the investigation would consist of and what it might find and what it might not find, and what she could expect the timeline to be. She listened carefully. She asked several questions that demonstrated a specific and practical understanding of how these matters worked. She said she was prepared to begin immediately. The investigation that followed was unusual in one respect. Most of these investigations produced their primary evidence through document research and through the cultivation of sources in the professional networks surrounding the subject. This investigation produced its primary evidence through physical surveillance, because what William Van Cortlandt was doing was happening primarily in the social spaces of the city, where document trails did not exist, and professional sources did not have access. The operatives who conducted the surveillance were 2 men who had worked for the agency for several years, and who were good at exactly this kind of work, the kind of work that required moving through the peripheral spaces of an upper-class social world without attracting the attention of the people at its centre. They attended to the question of where William Van Cortlandt spent his time and whom he spent it with, and the picture that emerged over 8 weeks of this attention was specific and useful. William had, in the period of the investigation, met with a lawyer 3 times. The lawyer was not one who appeared in any public record as having been retained by the Van Cortlandt family in previous matters. He was a specialist in estate and guardianship proceedings, which was consistent with what Eleanor had suspected but more specific than what she had known. William had also attended on 2 occasions a social dinner at which one of the guests was a physician named Dr. Aldous Marsh, who had a practice that included a significant proportion of elderly patients, and whose testimony and competency matters had been cited in several court proceedings in recent years. The dinners were at the home of an acquaintance whom William and Marsh both knew. Neither dinner had an obvious professional purpose. Both dinners had the character of social meetings that were doing work the parties preferred not to formalise. There was a third element of the investigation's findings that was more ambiguous, but that Eleanor received with a gravity that suggested it confirmed something she had already feared. William had met on 2 occasions with Frederick, not at either of their homes but at the Union Club, in one of the private rooms that the club maintained for members who wished to conduct meetings without being observed from the general rooms. The private rooms were not truly private in the sense of being unobservable, but they were sufficiently removed from casual observation that the choice of them indicated an intention to conduct the meeting without witnesses. Whatever had been discussed at those meetings was not accessible to the investigation. What was accessible was the fact of the meetings, the choice of venue, and the timing. Both meetings had occurred after William had first met with the estate lawyer. Eleanor read the report carefully. She asked the question about Frederick quietly and without apparent emotion, the question she'd been most afraid to ask and had known she would have to. What had Frederick known, and when, and what had he done with what he knew? The investigation could not answer this with certainty. It could say what Frederick had done. He had met twice with his brother in circumstances that suggested knowledge of whatever was being planned. He had not, so far as the investigation could determine, taken any action to obstruct the planning. He had not, so far as the investigation could determine, warned his mother. Eleanor sat with this information for a long moment. The fire in the grate was doing what fires do in the late afternoon of an autumn day, burning steadily and giving off the amber light that fills a room with a warmth that is partly temperature and partly something else. Then she asked what needed to happen next. What needed to happen next was the preparation of her response. Charlotte Vance, to whose office Eleanor went the following week with the investigation report in hand, was specific about what the response should consist of. Eleanor needed to document her competency comprehensively and convincingly, and she needed to do it in a way that would be credible to a court and that would be already complete before any proceeding was filed. This meant a thorough medical examination by a physician of unimpeachable standing, producing a written assessment that addressed not just her current physical and mental health, but the specific kinds of questions that a competency challenge would raise. It meant creating a documented record of her financial management, the decisions she had made and the reasoning behind them and the results they had produced, that would demonstrate clearly and specifically that she was managing her affairs with skill and judgment. It also meant something more subtle. It meant ensuring that the social narrative William had been circulating encountered, in the natural course of conversation, counter-evidence that was specific enough and credible enough to complicate the picture he had been drawing. This last element was something that Eleanor managed herself, with a directness and a social skill that Vance noted afterward as impressive. Eleanor began, in the weeks following her meeting with Vance, to have conversations in precisely the social context where William's narrative had been delivered, conversations in which her clarity and her judgment and her competence in managing her own affairs were observable to the people who'd been hearing the alternative account. She did this without mentioning what she was doing. She did not tell anyone that she knew what William had been saying, or that she was engaged in a deliberate effort to counter it. She simply began, in the natural course of social interaction, to be the kind of person that the narrative said she was not. The particular elegance of this was that it was entirely truthful. She was clear and organised and capable. She had always been. The only change was that she was now making sure that the people who needed to observe this had the opportunity to do so. Frederick came to her in February of 1894. He came on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, which was unusual in a way that meant something. He sat in the parlour for a time talking about nothing in particular, about family matters of the kind that brothers and sisters-in-law discuss when they are circling a subject they are not sure how to approach. Then he told her that William had retained a lawyer. He told her that he thought she should know. He said he had not been part of what William was planning and did not think it was right, and that he wished she had come to him, though of course he understood why she had not. Eleanor listened to all of this with the particular attention of someone who has been expecting something for a long time and is now hearing it, and who is also, simultaneously, making a rapid assessment of what it means and what response is appropriate. She told Frederick, calmly and directly, that she was aware of what was being planned and had already taken the legal steps appropriate to the situation. She told him that Charlotte Vance had reviewed the documentation of her estate management and found it entirely sound. She told him that her physician's assessment was complete and in her lawyer's possession. She told him, in the general terms that were sufficient for the purpose, that she was prepared. Frederick looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her that he thought William would be persuaded to abandon the matter if it was made sufficiently clear that it would not succeed. Eleanor said she thought that was probably correct. William's petition was never filed. The legal preparations that had been made were never deployed in a formal proceeding. The matter concluded not in a courtroom, but in a conversation between the two brothers and their respective lawyers, a conversation whose content Eleanor was not privy to, in which it was apparently made clear by the weight of preparation on Eleanor's side and the absence of a comparable preparation on William's side, that the proceeding would not produce the outcome William had anticipated. The investigation report and the legal preparation had done their work without becoming evidence in a formal proceeding. The information had been leverage, and the leverage had been sufficient. Eleanor Van Cortlandt continued to manage her own estate for 17 more years, until her death in 1910. Her estate was settled without controversy, according to the terms of her will, which she had drafted with Charlotte Vance's assistance in the spring of 1894 and had reviewed and updated every few years thereafter. The provisions of the will were specific and carefully constructed, and contained several features that addressed, precisely and in anticipatory detail, the kinds of challenges that her experience had taught her to expect. Her younger son William received his portion of the estate without legal challenge. Her elder son Frederick received his, along with a letter that Eleanor had written some years before, and left in the sealed envelope with her will, a letter whose contents remained private to the family. Her daughter received, along with the financial provision that the will made for her, a copy of the investigation report and the legal papers from the proceedings of 1893 and 1894, accompanied by a short letter in Eleanor's clear and careful handwriting. The letter said, "This is what it looked like, and this is what I did about it, and I am writing it down so that you will have the information if you ever need it." In the 1890s, a city like New York had developed a communications infrastructure that was, by the standards of the preceding generation, remarkable, and, by the standards of the generation that would follow, charming in its limitations. The telegraph had been available for decades, and was fast enough for many commercial purposes. The telephone was newer, installed in some business offices and in some wealthy households, but not yet universal, not yet the kind of ambient presence that would make later generations find it impossible to imagine life before it. Letters, carried by the postal service that made multiple deliveries each day in commercial districts, were the primary medium of business communication, and they were read and responded to with an efficiency that the volume of daily correspondence required. This communications infrastructure mattered to the investigations described in this story because it was the medium through which evidence travelled, and through which the plans of the various parties to these cases were coordinated. Letters could be intercepted in ways that telegrams and telephone conversations could not, or at least not easily. But more relevant than interception was the fact that letters and telegrams and telephone calls left traces, patterns of communication that could be read by someone who knew what to look for. Constance Harrowell was 37 years old when the matter of her guardianship came before the agency's attention in the winter of 1892. She was unmarried, which in the terminology of the era meant that she was a woman who had not, through the mechanism of marriage, transferred her legal identity into the custody of a husband, which meant that she existed in a somewhat ambiguous legal position. She was formally in control of her own affairs, but she was also, by the standards of her world, a woman without the protection that the social world considered appropriate, and therefore a woman whose affairs were, in some informal sense, subject to the attention and the oversight of the male members of her family in ways that were not precisely legal, but that were thoroughly understood by everyone involved. Her fortune was smaller than some of the other cases in this narrative. It was approximately $80,000, left to her by an aunt who had been independently wealthy, and who had liked Constance, and left to her outright rather than in a trust, which was unusual enough and relevant enough to understand. An outright bequest meant Constance owned the money directly, without trustees, and without the formal structure of administered accounts. This was more freedom than a trust provided, but it was also, under the right circumstances, more vulnerability, because there was no institutional buffer between Constance and the people who wished to establish control over her affairs. Those people were, in this case, her brothers. She had two of them, both older, both married, both living within the financial reach of a social world that was slightly above their actual means. The aunt's bequest to Constance rather than to her brothers was something the brothers had not expected and had not accepted, and their response to the surprise had been, over the months since the aunt's death, the development of a plan to have Constance declared incompetent to manage her own affairs and to have themselves appointed as her legal guardians. The plan had advanced further than Constance had initially realised when she first came to the agency, referred by a lawyer who had heard about the investigation services through channels he did not specify, and who had brought Constance to the agency, with the explanation that what she needed was the kind of information that investigation could provide. Constance had brought with her a quality of barely contained urgency that was different from the composed purposefulness of most of the women who came to this office. She was frightened, and the fright was specific rather than diffuse. She had learned, through a confidence broken in the way that confident confidences usually break, that her elder brother had already filed a petition with the court. Not prepared to filed. This was a different situation from Eleanor Van Cortlandt's. Eleanor had been in the preparation phase. Constance was in the response phase. The legal machinery had already been set in motion, and the question was not how to prevent the proceeding, but how to win it. The agency retained, in addition to the investigators who did the document and surveillance work, a working relationship with a lawyer named Thomas Morrow, who specialised in exactly this kind of defence. Not Charlotte Vance, whose practice was in New York while Morrow's was in the jurisdiction where Constance's case had been filed. Morrow was, in some ways, a complement to the investigation service. Where the investigators found the information, Morrow translated the information into the legal arguments that courts could act on. The investigation in Constance's case moved quickly by necessity, because the proceeding had already been filed, and the timeline was set by the court's calendar rather than by the investigation's pace. What the investigators needed to find and found was the evidentiary foundation of the brothers' case. The petition would assert that Constance was incompetent to manage her affairs. To support that assertion, the brothers would need witnesses, ideally physicians who could testify about her mental state, and ideally other witnesses who could speak to observed behaviour that supported the incompetency narrative. The investigators identified 3 witnesses the brothers had apparently lined up: a physician named Dr. George Hendricks, who was known to both brothers through a social connection and who had a practice that had testified in several competency matters in the past; a family friend named Mrs. Sarah Abbott, who was the wife of a business associate of the elder brother and who had apparently been persuaded to describe a particular incident from a dinner party several months ago in terms that suggested Constance's behaviour had been erratic; and a former employee of Constance's, a housekeeper who had been dismissed, under circumstances that the investigation suggested were related to this proceeding, and who had been providing statements about Constance's household management that were framed in the most unfavourable possible light. This information, gathered and documented in the 2 weeks following Constance's first visit to the agency, went directly to Morrow, who incorporated it into the legal strategy for the defence. The defence had several elements. The first was the documentation of Constance's competency, which was handled in the same way it had been handled in other cases: a thorough examination by a physician whose credentials and independence were unimpeachable, producing a written assessment that was specific and favourable and already complete before the proceeding began. The second was the preparation for the cross-examination of the brothers' witnesses. Morrow, knowing who the witnesses were and what they were expected to say, was able to prepare questions that addressed the specific weaknesses in each witness's testimony. He knew that Mrs. Abbott had been at the dinner party in question and had been spoken to by the elder brother afterward, in a conversation that had lasted some time and that had apparently shaped her recollection of the evening in a particular direction. He knew that the former housekeeper had been dismissed not for any reason related to her performance, but because she had been in a dispute with Constance over wages that she believed she was owed, a dispute that created an obvious and documentable motivation for unfavourable testimony. He knew about Dr. Hendricks' pattern of testimony in previous competency proceedings, a pattern that showed a high rate of finding incompetency in patients referred by the families of those patients, a pattern that was legally significant as evidence of potential bias. The proceeding took place over 2 days. Morrow's cross-examinations of the brothers' witnesses were effective in the specific ways that effective cross-examinations are effective, not by creating drama but by exposing, quietly and through document and fact, the specific ways in which each witness's testimony was less reliable than it appeared. Mrs. Abbott's account of the dinner party was shown to have been shaped by a conversation with the elder brother that had occurred afterward. The former housekeeper's testimony was placed in the context of the dismissed wage dispute. Dr. Hendricks's pattern of testimony was documented and presented. Constance's own physician testified to her complete competence in calm and specific terms. The application was denied. The brothers did not challenge the denial. The proceeding was over. Constance received the news in Morrow's office and sat with it for a long, quiet moment. Then she asked what she should do to ensure that it could not happen again. What she should do, Morrow told her, was to create the kind of documented record of her financial management that would make a future proceeding considerably more difficult to mount. She should keep clear, organised records of her investment decisions and their results. She should conduct her financial affairs with the kind of visible orderliness that would give any future challenger very little surface to work with. She should designate a power of attorney to a trusted person, preferably someone with no family connection to the brothers, who would be able to act on her behalf in the event of any future incapacity. She should also, Morrow told her gently, consider whether $80,000 in an outright personal account was the most useful way to hold the money, or whether the structure of a trust, with a well-chosen institutional trustee who had no connection to her family, might provide a more durable protection. Constance thought about this for some weeks. She consulted with a financial advisor whose recommendation came from a source she trusted. She created a trust. She chose as trustee an institution rather than an individual. She drafted the trust documents with specific provisions that addressed, in anticipatory detail, the categories of challenge that her experience had taught her to expect. The $80,000 were never threatened again. The Whisper campaign, when it had run, had been saying something that the wire had been used to coordinate. The letters and the meetings and the conversations between the brothers and their witnesses had left traces that the investigation had found and that the legal preparation had used. The watching had come, in this case, just barely in time. But it had come. There is a kind of conversation that happens between numbers, a conversation that is invisible until someone with the right knowledge decides to listen to it. The ledgers of a trust or an estate or a financial account contain not just the record of what was done, but the implied record of what was not done, the gaps and the patterns and the deviations from what the numbers should have been doing if they had been doing what they were supposed to do. The investigators who specialized in financial document research in the 1880s and 1890s were, in the most precise sense, people who listened to this conversation. They were people who could look at a set of financial records and hear, beneath the formal record of transactions, the quieter conversation about what the transactions meant and who they served, and whether the person whose interests the records were supposed to reflect was, in fact, being served. The case that Harrington's agency handled in the spring of 1894 was a case that came to him not through the usual channel of a woman who had identified a specific problem and come seeking the information to address it, but through the more oblique channel of a lawyer who had encountered, in the course of handling one matter, the evidence of a different matter that required a different kind of attention. The lawyer was a woman named Helena Pierce, who had a practice that handled a range of matters for female clients, but whose particular expertise was in estate and trust administration. She had been retained by a client whose situation she was not at liberty to describe in detail, but whose trust she had been examining as part of a related legal matter, and in the course of that examination, she had found something that suggested that the trust was being administered in a way that required investigation before any legal action could be taken. She described the situation in the general terms that her professional obligations permitted. There was a trust. The trust had a beneficiary who was a woman in her late 60s. The trust had a trustee who was a man with a professional background in financial management. The trust had been established approximately 15 years ago and had been administered over that period without any formal proceeding or dispute. The beneficiary was not particularly alarmed about the administration of the trust. She was not the person who had identified the problem. The problem had been identified by the lawyer herself, in the course of reviewing the trust's records for reasons that were unrelated to the administration question, and what she had found was a discrepancy that she could not explain on any reading of the records that was consistent with honest management. The discrepancy was this. The trust's stated investment portfolio, as reported in the quarterly statements provided to the beneficiary, did not match the investment portfolio that the records of the financial institutions that held the trust's assets actually showed. The difference was not random, it was systematic. The trust's quarterly statements showed a portfolio of conservative, low-risk investments in government bonds and blue-chip equities, of the kind appropriate for a trust of this size and for a beneficiary of this age. The records of the financial institutions showed a portfolio that included, alongside those conservative instruments, a significant allocation to several ventures that were considerably more speculative and considerably less appropriate. The ventures were not named in the financial institution records in a way that made their nature obvious. They were referred to by the kind of coded shorthand that financial records use for instruments, whose full descriptions are held in separate documentation. But the investigation that followed, tracing the specific instruments through the institutional records to the actual entities they represented, found that several of them were ventures in which the trustee himself had significant personal investments. The pattern was the pattern. The trustee was investing the trust's assets in ventures that benefited himself, reporting to the beneficiary a sanitized version of the portfolio that excluded the self-interested positions, and collecting, on the self-interested investments, returns that were not being attributed to the trust but were instead accruing to his own account. The beneficiary, a woman who had been receiving the income the trust generated in its conservative positions and had been told that the income was what the trust's investments should produce, had no way of knowing that there was another version of the portfolio she had not been told. The quarterly statements she received were accurate as far as they went. They simply did not go all the way. When the investigation was complete, the file that was assembled for the lawyer contained the documented discrepancy between the stated and actual portfolios, the traced connections between the undisclosed investments and the trustee's personal financial interests, and an accounting of the difference between what the trust's full portfolio had actually earned and what had been reported to the beneficiary. The beneficiary, when she was shown this information through her lawyer, received it with the particular stillness of someone hearing something they have not wanted to hear, but have perhaps, on some level, been preparing to hear for a long time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked how much. The accounting was careful and specific. Over the period of the investigation's coverage, which was the 5 most recent years of the trust's administration, the amount by which the beneficiary had been underpaid, the difference between what the trust had earned and what she had received was approximately $43,000. She sat with this. Then she said very quietly that she had trusted him for 15 years. The lawyer did not say anything for a moment because there was nothing that was both true and useful to say to that. What was true was that the trust had been betrayed, and that the betrayal had been ongoing for years, and that the 15 years of trust had been given to someone who had not been worthy of them. This was all true. None of it was useful to say to someone who was currently in the process of receiving it. What was useful was what the lawyer did say, which was that the documentation of the misconduct was thorough and specific, and that the legal remedies available were significant, and that the next step was to determine which of those remedies was most appropriate to pursue. The legal remedies were pursued, the trustee was removed. A full accounting of the trust's history was ordered by the court. The recovery, which included the underpaid income and the trustee's improper fees, was substantial. But the case also produced something that went beyond its own resolution. The lawyer, Helena Pierce, took the documented pattern of the trustee's conduct and circulated it, in appropriate professional contexts, as an example of the specific mechanisms that the financial oversight of women's trusts needed to be designed to prevent. She wrote, in a legal journal that some of her colleagues read, a short piece about the mechanics of trust misadministration in the context of female beneficiaries, a piece that was careful enough and specific enough to be useful to other lawyers who were handling similar cases without yet having the conceptual framework for understanding what they were seeing. The piece was not widely read. The journal had a small circulation, and the piece was couched in the technical language that legal writing required. But it was read by the people who mattered, which is to say by the lawyers who were doing this kind of work and who recognized in it the description of something they had been seeing in practice, without having had occasion to articulate. The ledgers said what the ledgers said, but reading them required knowing how to listen to the conversation they were having, the conversation between what was recorded and what was hidden, and what the difference between those two things meant. More and more people were learning to listen. Newport, Rhode Island, in the summer months of the 1880s and 1890s, was a particular kind of theatre, and like all theatres it had its front of house and its backstage, its public performance and its private machinery, and understanding what happened in it required attending to both. The front of house was famous. It was the Gilded Age at its most elaborately visible. The great cottages, which were houses of 40 and 50 and 60 rooms, built by fortunes made in the industrial expansion of the post-war decades, and maintained by the labour of hundreds of servants, the lawn parties and the cotillions and the coaching parades and the casino events that constituted the formal social calendar, the carriages on Bellevue Avenue and the bathing at the beach and the evening promenades along the cliff walk. This was the Newport that was reported in the society columns and that was understood by the people who participated in it and by the much larger public that followed its reports as the fullest expression of what American wealth looked like when it had enough time and enough money and enough accumulated social confidence to express itself freely. The backstage was less reported and more interesting. The backstage was where the actual social work of Newport happened. The seasonal congregating of the wealthy families of New York and Boston and Philadelphia in this relatively small geographic space produced a compression of social interaction that was unusual even by the standards of a social class that lived in unusual proximity to itself. The same families encountered each other daily over the course of a season that ran from June to September. The children of those families were in the same social spaces. The business relationships and the matrimonial calculations and the financial negotiations and the personal hostilities that were diffused across large cities during the other 3 seasons of the year were all concentrated into these few months on this peninsula. And the backstage work of all those calculations and negotiations and hostilities was conducted in the peripheral spaces and the private conversations and the informal encounters that the formal calendar created the occasion for. The walk along the cliff walk that happened to encounter someone who happened to have something to say, the lawn party that provided the cover for a conversation that could not easily happen elsewhere, the dinner table that placed 2 people next to each other in a way that had been arranged with more deliberation than the hostess acknowledged. For the investigations described in this story, Newport was both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge was the increased visibility. Newport's compression of social interaction meant that any investigation conducted there was conducted in a space where everyone was, in some sense, watching everyone else, and where the presence of an unfamiliar face or an unusual association could be noticed and remarked upon, in ways that a larger and less socially intense city did not produce. The opportunity was the same compression, seen from the investigator's perspective. The same visibility that created risk also created information. In Newport, patterns of association that would have been invisible in the diffused social geography of a city became apparent. The trustee who saw the brother at a dinner in New York in February, and then at a club in April, and then on a train in June, might be meeting coincidentally. The trustee who was at the same house party in Newport in July as the brother, and who appeared at the same garden party 2 weeks later, and who was seen leaving the same cottage in the early morning on a Tuesday in August, was probably not. The case that brought Harrington to Newport in the summer of 1895 was not formally a Newport case. It was a New York case, concerning a woman whose primary residence was in the city, and whose legal affairs were conducted there, but whose family gathered in Newport every summer in the way that families of their class gathered in Newport, and whose summer gathering provided the context for exactly the kind of informal coordination that the case was about. The woman, who identified herself to Harrington only as Miss A, was 29, and had recently come into the management of a trust that her grandfather had established for her at her birth, and that her father had administered until his death the previous year. The trust had then passed to the administration of a board of 3 trustees, one of whom was a family friend of 30 years' standing, and 2 of whom were professionals retained by the family estate. What Miss A had observed since the trusteeship passed to the board was a pattern of communication between the trustees and certain members of her extended family that seemed, to her careful attention, to be more frequent and more substantive than the routine reporting relationship between trustees and interested parties would explain. She had not yet been able to identify what specifically was being communicated. She knew the pattern of communication was there because she had noticed its effects in the trustees' behaviour toward her, in the slight difference between how they responded to her questions and how she would have expected them to respond, in the particular quality of certain conversations that felt like they were carrying more information than was being exchanged. This was the kind of initial assessment that came from exactly the kind of long, patient attention that these women had learned to pay to the systems they were inside. The specific assessment was, something is being coordinated, and I am not part of the coordination. The investigation confirmed, over the course of the Newport season, that the coordination existed and gave it a more specific shape. 2 members of Miss A's extended family, a male cousin and a male second cousin who both had financial interests that were connected at various removes to the management of her trust, were using the Newport season to conduct meetings with 2 of her 3 trustees that had the character of informal but purposeful consultation. The meetings were in the peripheral social spaces, the lawn of a shared acquaintance, the card room at the casino, the informal gatherings at certain cottages where the guest lists overlapped in predictable ways. The content of these meetings was not accessible to direct observation, but the pattern of them, the frequency and the context and the participants and the timing relative to specific decisions the trustees had made or were preparing to make, allowed a reading of their purpose that was, in Harrington's assessment, reliable enough to report. Miss A received this report at the end of August in New York, in the calm and practical manner that she had brought to every stage of the process. She asked what use the information was. The use was this. She now knew that 2 of her 3 trustees were receiving informal guidance from family members who had financial interests that were not aligned with hers. She did not know yet whether that informal guidance had produced specific acts of misadministration, but she had the documented pattern of the relationships from which such misadministration was likely to emerge. She was now in a position to take that documented pattern to her lawyers and to begin the process of establishing her own independent legal review of the trust's administration. She was also in a position to feed, carefully and selectively, information into the coordination network that the investigation had identified. Not fabricated information, accurate information about her own preparedness, about the legal review that was underway, about the specific mechanisms she was putting in place to ensure that the trust was administered in her interests. Information that, if it reached the trustees through the informal channels that the coordination network represented, would adjust the calculations of the people involved. This second use was more subtle and in some ways more effective than the legal review alone would have been. The coordination network, which had been operating on the assumption that Miss A was uninformed about its existence, had to recalculate when it became apparent that she was not. The trustees' behaviour shifted over the following months in ways that were consistent with a recalculation. The meetings with the family members became less frequent. The quality of the communication with Miss A improved, became more complete and more responsive. The specific financial decisions that had been trending in directions that did not serve her interests began trending differently. The legal review, when it was completed, found some concerns but nothing that rose to the level of documented misconduct sufficient for formal proceedings. The concerns were addressed through the restructuring of the trust's governance, negotiated through the lawyers and resulting in a revised arrangement that gave Miss A considerably more oversight and considerably more influence over the trustees' decisions. Newport had been the theatre. The backstage machinery had been visible for long enough and to the right eyes, and the visibility had been useful. The summer season continued. The cottages were lit in the evenings and the cliff walk was promenaded in the afternoons, and the social calendar turned with the regularity that made it feel, from the front of house, like a beautiful and effortless performance. In the back, as always, the work was being done. It would be a mistake to think of the women in this story as solitary figures, each isolated in her own particular situation, each finding her way to the detective agency and the sympathetic lawyer through her own private resourcefulness. They were not solitary. They were part of a network, informal and never fully articulated but real and functional, and over time increasingly effective. The network was built on the simple mechanism that social networks are always built on: shared experience and mutual trust, and the recognition that the information held by people in similar situations is more useful when shared than when kept separate. It worked through the kind of communication that women of this class conducted in the spaces between the formal social obligations that structured their days. The visit made to a friend in the early afternoon, the walk taken after church on Sunday that coincided with the walk of a neighbour, the hour in the parlour when the caller stayed past the formal visiting time because the conversation had moved to a register that both parties found worth continuing. These were not the dramatic communications of a coordinated movement. They were the ordinary communications of intelligent people who had similar concerns and who had, over time, created between themselves the informal but reliable infrastructure through which relevant information moved. What moved through this infrastructure was several kinds of information. The first kind was the referral. A woman who had used the detective agency and found it useful told another woman about it, in the careful and particular way that recommendations of this kind were made in a world where the recommendation itself could not be explicit. She did not say, in a drawing room with other guests present, that she had hired a detective to investigate her trustees. She found the occasion, the appropriate private moment with the appropriate person, and she made the relevant information available in a form that the recipient could receive and act on. The referral was the foundation of the agency's female client base. Harrington had not advertised these services, had not sought these clients through the normal channels of professional publicity. The clients came to him through the network, which meant that they arrived already informed, already prepared, already carrying the understanding that using these services was a thing that women in their situation did, that it was not eccentric or transgressive, or the kind of thing that needed to be apologized for, that it was simply one of the resources available to a woman who was trying to protect her interests, and who had the sense to use what was available. The second kind of information that moved through the network was legal knowledge. The women in the network, taken collectively, had an accumulating practical understanding of the specific legal mechanisms that were used against them and the specific legal mechanisms that could be used in response. This was not abstract legal knowledge. It was the specific practical knowledge of what a competency petition looked like and what it required to support it, and what had worked to defeat it in cases the network knew about directly. It was the knowledge of which lawyers were useful for these specific kinds of cases and which were less useful, and which, importantly, were not safe to use because their loyalties might lie elsewhere. This knowledge was worth a great deal. The women who came to Harrington's agency and to Charlotte Vance's office and to Thomas Morrow's practice were, by the time they arrived, considerably better prepared than women who arrived without the network's preparation. They knew what questions to ask, they knew what to bring with them, they knew the general shape of what was possible and what it would require and what it would cost. The third kind of information was the emotional kind, and this may have been the most valuable of all. The situation these women were in had specific emotional characteristics that were difficult to carry alone. It was frightening in a way that was hard to share with anyone who had not experienced it, because the specific fear of having your competency questioned and your freedom threatened and your financial independence dismantled by the people who were supposed to love you was not a fear that ordinary social consolation addressed. It was too specific and too large and too bound up with the complex reality of family relationships that contained genuine love alongside the genuine threat. But a woman who had been through the process, who had hired the detective and retained the lawyer, and received the report and prepared the response and survived the proceeding or prevented it, could speak to the fear from experience. She could say, "I know what this feels like. I know it is real. I know that the fact that it is coming from your family does not make it less real or less threatening. I know that you can get through it. I know this because I did." This is a different thing from general consolation. It is specific, and it is founded on shared experience, and it is worth a great deal to someone who is frightened and uncertain and carrying the situation alone. The network provided this. Not systematically, not through any formal structure of support, through the ordinary human mechanism of one woman telling another, in the right moment, what she knew from her own experience. There was a gathering in the autumn of 1896 at the home of a woman named Margaret Stanfield in Manhattan. The gathering was not organised as any kind of formal meeting. It was an afternoon tea of the kind that Margaret Stanfield held regularly, with a changing collection of women who moved in overlapping social circles. The gathering on this particular afternoon had, in its composition, a character that was not entirely coincidental. A significant number of the women present had had, at various points in the preceding 5 years, some involvement with the specific kind of situation this story has been describing. They did not discuss that involvement explicitly. They discussed other things, the things that women of their class and era discussed at afternoon teas, with the ease of people who know each other well and the pleasure of intelligent people in each other's company. But underneath the conversation there was a shared understanding, a recognition that moved between them without being stated, that they were a particular kind of community, that the experiences that had brought several of them to the same difficult moments had made them, in some way that the formal language of their world did not have a term for, something to each other. Margaret Stanfield, who had had her own situation several years before and had been through the full range of detective investigation and legal preparation and threatened proceeding and resolution, had organised the gathering with an awareness of this. She had not told any of the guests why she had invited who she had invited. She trusted the gathering to do its own work, and it did. The afternoon produced one practical outcome that was visible and several that were not. The visible outcome was that one of the women present, who was currently in the early stages of a situation she had not yet fully identified as requiring the kind of response that the network could provide, was introduced by Margaret to a lawyer who could help. The introduction was made in the natural and unremarkable way that introductions are made at afternoon teas, with a lightness that did not reveal its weight. The invisible outcomes were the conversations and the confirmations and the knowledge exchanged in the ordinary language of an afternoon gathering that was also, underneath its ordinary surface, the work of a community maintaining itself. The network was never formalized. It never had a name or a structure or a membership. It was, at every moment, exactly what it appeared to be: a set of women who knew each other and shared information and offered what assistance they could in the way that intelligent people who care about each other do. The fact that this ordinary human solidarity was being deployed in the service of an extraordinary project, the protection of women's financial independence in a world designed to prevent it, was not something that needed to be articulated for it to be real. It was real. It had effects that were documentable. Cases were won because of information that moved through the network. Women were prepared because of referrals the network provided. Lawyers were retained, and investigators were engaged, and legal proceedings were prevented or successfully defended because the knowledge of how to do these things was shared among people who had experience of doing them. The women in that parlour on a Tuesday afternoon in October, drinking tea and talking about the things that women of their world talked about, were part of a community that was, in the most practical sense, changing something. One conversation at a time. Not every investigation that ended with a successful outcome ended with a formal legal proceeding. This is worth saying explicitly, because the most dramatic outcomes are not always the most representative ones, and because the investigations that did not produce courtroom battles were, in many cases, the ones that served the client's interests most effectively. The value of information is not only what you can do with it legally, it is also what you know that you did not know before, which changes how you move through the world in ways that do not necessarily become visible in formal proceedings. There were women who came to the agency and received reports and used those reports to make decisions that never required the assistance of a court or the formal intervention of a legal process. They used the information to restructure their relationships with their trustees and their lawyers and their family members, to exit arrangements that had been serving others' interests rather than their own, to enter new arrangements designed with the specific knowledge of what needed to be prevented. There were women who used the reports to prepare for eventualities that never arrived, because the preparation itself changed the probability of the eventualities arriving. A woman who was demonstrably prepared for a competency challenge was a less attractive target for one, because the challenge's success depended on an element of surprise and on the assumption that the subject would be found unprepared. The preparation was its own deterrent. There were also women who, having read the report and understood what it described, made decisions that were entirely private, decisions about trust and relationship and family that they did not share with the agency or with their lawyers or with anyone else. The investigation had given them information. What they did with that information in the most personal dimensions of their lives was their own business. One of these cases stayed with Harrington in a particular way over the years. He had handled it in 1897, and it had been brought to him by a woman he would remember as Mrs. C, using the initial rather than the name that her trust and discretion required. Mrs. C was a widow in her early 60s whose husband had died 11 years before, leaving her with a comfortable fortune managed by a board of trustees that included two of her late husband's former business partners and a lawyer who had been associated with the family for many years. The trust had been administered, in the years since her husband's death, in a way that was formally correct and that produced an income she was comfortable on, and she had not had reason until recently to question it. What had brought her to the agency was not, as it was in other cases, a specific financial concern. It was a personal concern, a concern about the nature of the relationships she had been inside for 11 years, and about whether what she had understood those relationships to be was accurate. She had become aware, through a conversation that had happened in a way she described as accidental, but that the investigation would not find accidental at all, that one of her late husband's former business partners, who served as one of her trustees and who had been a trusted presence in her household since her husband's death, had been providing information about her household and her health and her activities to her adult stepchildren from her husband's first marriage. The adult stepchildren were not parties to the trust. They were not legally involved in her affairs, but they were people who had an interest in the eventual disposition of her estate, and the information being provided to them was, in the context of that interest, potentially the basis for the kind of challenge to her independence that the pattern she had read about in various ways made her fear. She wanted to know how extensive the information sharing was, how long it had been happening, and who was aware of it. The investigation took 6 weeks and was conducted with particular care, because the social relationships involved were old and complex, and the investigation needed to find what it needed to find without disrupting things in ways that would not serve the client. What it found was more extensive than Mrs. C had feared, and less extensive than her worst fears had suggested. The trustee had been providing regular, detailed reports about her health and her activities and her household management to both of her adult stepchildren for approximately 3 years. The reports were communicated informally through the ordinary social contacts that the trustee maintained with the stepchildren, but they were regular enough and detailed enough that they constituted a systematic intelligence gathering that was not authorized by the trust's terms. The trustee had also, on 2 occasions, provided one of the stepchildren with documents relating to the trust's administration in advance of providing copies to Mrs. C herself. There was no evidence that this information sharing had yet produced any formal legal action. The stepchildren had, so far as the investigation could determine, been using the information to maintain an awareness of the situation, rather than to prepare a specific proceeding. Mrs. C received the report in the same manner in which she had described her concerns, with a composed exterior that carried underneath it something that Harrington would have described as grief rather than fear. She sat with the report for a long time. She asked several questions. Then she said that she had known the trustee for 31 years, that he had been a friend of her husband's before she had known either of them, and that she had believed until recently that he was, in the way she had used the word, trustworthy. She was not asking him for a response to this. She was simply saying it. He understood that. She did not file a legal complaint against the trustee. She did not seek his removal through any formal process. What she did was arrange, quietly and through her own lawyers, a restructuring of the trust's governance that had the practical effect of reducing the trustee's individual access to information about her affairs and increasing the oversight mechanisms that the other trustees exercised over each of their colleagues. She also, and this was the part of the resolution that she told him about some months later when she returned for a brief consultation on a different matter, had a conversation with the trustee. She had told him what she knew, not in a confrontational way, not with the investigation report on the table between them, not as an accusation that required a defense. She had told him, in the direct and specific way that was possible between 2 people who had known each other for 31 years, that she was aware of the information he had been sharing with her stepchildren, and that she had found it hurtful, and that she was asking him, as a friend, not to continue it. He had told her that he had believed he was protecting her interests by keeping the stepchildren informed about her welfare. He had told her that he had not understood, until she described it to him now, how it would appear to her. She told him that she believed he was sincere in this, and she also told him that sincerity was not the same thing as serving her interests, and that she was capable of determining what served her interests and communicating that to the people in her life. He did not provide further information to the stepchildren. The restructured governance of the trust remained in place. The relationship between them continued, as 31-year friendships sometimes do, in the complicated space between what had been and what would be, with a new clarity about certain things that had previously been unspoken. The report that had made this possible had never been filed in any court, had never appeared in any legal proceeding, had never been produced as evidence. It existed in Mrs. C's private papers and in the agency's confidential files and nowhere else. It had done its work in the private space where the most significant decisions of people's lives are usually made, in the conversation between 2 people, in a room, with the truth on the table between them. Act 12. What the courts made of it. The legal landscape that these women navigated was not a fixed terrain. It was shifting, slowly and unevenly, over the decades of the Gilded Age and the early years of the 20th century, in ways that were partly the result of formal legal change and partly the result of the accumulated weight of individual cases decided one at a time by courts that were building, case by case, something that functioned as practical precedent even when it was not formally designated as such. The formal legal changes were real, but limited. The Married Women's Property Acts, which had passed in New York in 1848, and which had been gradually strengthened and replicated in other states in the decades that followed, had established on paper the principle that a woman could own property in her own name and could protect it from her husband's creditors. The practical application of this principle was uneven, contested, and dependent on lawyers and judges who had their own understandings of what the principle required and their own degrees of sympathy with the women who sought to invoke it. What the individual cases contributed to this shifting landscape was something different from and complementary to the formal legal changes. Each case that was argued and decided became part of the accumulated understanding of what the law required in specific circumstances, part of the informal guide that lawyers used when they assessed the likely outcome of a new proceeding, part of the slowly shifting expectations that judges brought to cases of this kind. The shift was not linear, and it was not universal. Courts in different jurisdictions moved at different speeds. Individual judges varied in their sympathies and their understandings. The same facts, in front of different courts, could produce different outcomes. But the direction of the shift, read over the decades, was toward a slightly increased willingness to take seriously the claims that women were making about the management of their financial affairs. Not a dramatic shift, not a transformation. A gradual, contested, frequently reversed movement toward treating a woman who said that her trust was being mismanaged not as a confused and anxious person whose concerns could be addressed by patient reassurance, but as a person making a legal claim that deserved the same investigation and the same evidentiary standard that any other legal claim received. This shift was partly the result of the accumulated weight of cases in which women had arrived, with thorough, documented evidence of specific misconduct. When a court saw, in a specific case, the kind of evidence that Lavinia Whitmore's lawyers had produced, or that the lawyers in the Constance Harrowell matter had assembled, it was harder to dismiss the claim as unfounded. The documentation made the claim concrete, gave it the specificity that legal reasoning required, moved it from the category of grievance that a woman was unreasonably making to the category of wrong that the law was equipped to address. The documentation was the product of the investigations. The investigations were the product of the women who had decided to commission them. The shift in the legal landscape was, in this specific and traceable way, a product of the decisions made by specific women in specific parlours on specific evenings, decisions to pick up a pen and write a letter and send it to an address in a commercial district of the city. Charlotte Vance, who had been practicing for nearly 15 years by the end of the 1890s, had watched this shift with the careful attention of someone whose professional life was spent inside it. She had seen the cases that had contributed to it. She had argued several of them herself, and she had noticed with the same patience and precision that characterized her legal work the ways in which the shift was real and the ways in which it was not yet what it needed to be. The shift was real in the area of trust misadministration. Courts were more willing, by the later 1890s, to scrutinize the management of trust for female beneficiaries and to apply a genuine fiduciary standard to that scrutiny. This did not mean they always found in the beneficiary's favour. It meant they were more willing to look at the evidence seriously and to require trustees to account for their management in specific, documentable ways. The shift was less real in the area of competency proceedings. This was the area where the legal system's susceptibility to the era's assumptions about women was most directly engaged, because the competency proceeding was, at its foundation, a proceeding that asked a court to assess a woman's capacity to manage her own affairs, and the court was composed of men whose understanding of women's capacity was shaped by the same cultural assumptions that had created the problem in the first place. Here the progress was slower and more contested, and the importance of thorough preparation was correspondingly greater. The cases in which women successfully defeated competency challenges were almost invariably cases in which the preparation had been thorough, the documentation was comprehensive, and the legal representation was skilled enough to translate the documented evidence into the specific legal arguments that courts were equipped to evaluate. The cases that did not succeed were, in a significant proportion, cases in which the woman had not had the preparation time or the resources or the specific knowledge that the network provided. They were cases in which the proceeding had come too quickly or too completely as a surprise, or in which the woman had relied on legal representation that was not equipped for or committed to this specific kind of defense. This is not a comfortable thing to say. It means that the improved outcomes that the investigations and the network made possible were not available equally to all women in these situations. They were available to the women who had money enough to pay for the investigation and the legal defense, who had connections that brought them to the network's attention in time, who had the specific kind of preparation that the situation required. This was not nothing. The women who benefited were real people whose circumstances were genuinely improved. But the benefit was not universal, and the limitation of its availability was part of the reality of the situation, and should be part of any account of it. Charlotte Vance knew this. She had cases that she thought about in the evenings, the cases that had not gone well, the women who had come too late or with too little, or in circumstances where the machinery of the opposing side had already done its work. These cases did not outweigh the cases that had succeeded, but they were part of the picture, and an honest accounting of the period required including them. What she also knew was that the shift that was happening, slow and contested as it was real, and was the product of specific work by specific people, and that the work was worth continuing. The improvement was not sufficient. It was real. Both things were true simultaneously, and both things mattered. The courthouse steps in Lower Manhattan, on a cold morning in November of 1899, received the footsteps of Charlotte Vance and her client, a woman in her 50s who had been through a proceeding that had lasted 6 weeks, and had ended, that morning, with a judgment in her favour. The client had arrived at the courthouse 3 years before, as a woman whose trustees had been managing her affairs in ways that had cost her a significant portion of what she was entitled to. She left as a woman with a court order for accounting and a judgment for the improperly taken funds, and an independent institutional trustee who would ensure that the administration of her trust met the standards that the law required. She did not make a speech. She did not speak to the newspapers, which were present because the case had attracted a moderate amount of attention in the legal community. She thanked her lawyer and walked to her carriage and went home. In the carriage she was quiet for the length of the ride. When she arrived at her house, she sat in the parlour for some time before going upstairs to change out of her court clothes. The parlour was the same parlour. The fire was burning steadily in the grate. The curtains were drawn against the November afternoon. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the hour in its ordinary way. Everything was the same, and nothing was quite the same, which is often how it is when something important has been resolved. It would not be honest to tell only the stories of success. There were women in these cases who did not succeed, or who succeeded in some dimensions of their situation but not others, or whose victories were partial in ways that the word victory does not quite contain. The incompleteness of victory was sometimes legal. A court might remove a trustee and order an accounting, but the full recovery of what had been improperly taken was not always achievable. Investment losses caused by self-interested decisions were difficult to quantify and to attribute to specific misconduct in the way that legal recovery required. The gap between what had been taken and what could be proven to a legal standard, and then actually recovered from a defendant who might have dissipated the assets, was sometimes significant. The incompleteness was sometimes temporal. Women who came to these situations late in life, after years of misadministration had already occurred, could secure better administration going forward, but could not recover the years that had passed. The trust that had been managed in someone else's interest for 15 years could be returned to proper management, but the 15 years was spent. And sometimes the incompleteness was simply the kind that comes with fighting for a long time against people who have resources and social standing, and the systemic advantage of a world designed to support their position. You could win the legal case. You could not always win back the relationship or the family standing, or the years of anxiety or the specific kind of trust that had been broken. There was a woman, in the records that Harrington maintained, whose case had proceeded through all the correct steps and had produced a legal outcome that was formally satisfactory and that had not given her what she had actually needed. Her situation had involved a brother whose conduct, documented by the investigation and addressed by the legal proceedings, had been clearly and specifically wrong. The law had said so. The court had said so. The accounting had been ordered and the trustee had been restructured and the formal resolution was complete. But the brother was still her brother, and the knowledge of what he had done, which had been, in the investigation and the proceedings, the precise and documented knowledge that she had needed for the legal purpose, was also the knowledge she had to live with in the other dimensions of her life. The knowledge that someone who had said the things that brothers say, who had been present at the specific events that brothers are present for, had been, for years, working against her interests with a thoroughness and a patience that required premeditation. This was not a surprise exactly. She had suspected it before she'd known it. But suspicion and knowledge are different, and the knowledge, when it came fully formed and documented, was heavier than the suspicion had been. The legal victory had changed the financial situation. It had not changed the brother. He had complied with the court's order. He had not acknowledged in any direct way what he had done. The legal proceeding had addressed the legal wrong without requiring the personal acknowledgement that, in a different world, might have been available. She managed this. She was not destroyed by it. She continued to live well, in the house that was now properly administered for her benefit, with the income that was now correctly calculated and completely paid. She had the life she had been entitled to. But she also had the knowledge, and the knowledge was something she carried. There were also women whose situations had a quality of genuine grief about them, grief not for their own circumstances, but for what they had learned about the people they loved most. The woman whose trustee had been providing information to her stepchildren, Mrs. C in the private ledger, had managed her situation with a composure and a directness that Harrington had found admirable. But composure is not the same thing as the absence of pain, and what had happened between her and the trustee of 31 years' acquaintance, however honestly it had been addressed, had cost something that no legal process could quantify. The investigations produced accurate information. Accurate information about human beings produced grief sometimes, as well as the practical clarity that was the investigation's purpose. These two things existed simultaneously, and both of them were real. The court cases that failed, the proceedings in which the preparation had been insufficient or the timing had been wrong, or the judge had been insufficiently sympathetic, produced outcomes that were worse than grief. They produced women who had come through a difficult and exposing legal process, and emerged from it without the protection the process had been supposed to provide, and who now had to manage their situations in the knowledge that the legal avenue had been tried and had not succeeded. These women still had the other resources. The information they had gathered could still be used as leverage in informal negotiations. The documentation could still serve as the basis for restructuring arrangements in ways that did not require court approval. The network could still provide the practical knowledge and the personal support that made managing difficult situations more possible. But the failure of the formal legal process was a genuine loss, and it would be dishonest to describe it otherwise. Honesty is the appropriate register for this part of the story. The women in these cases were not characters in a narrative designed to produce satisfying resolutions. They were people in real situations with real outcomes, and the outcomes were not uniformly good, and the ones that were good were not uniformly complete. What was true of all of them, the successful cases and the unsuccessful ones and the ones that occupied the complicated middle ground, was that the women in them had made the choice to act. They had decided, in the face of systems designed to discourage them from acting, that action was appropriate and that they were capable of it. They had found the resources the action required and engaged them. They had followed the process through its difficult stages with the patience and the precision that the process demanded. This choice and this perseverance was theirs regardless of the outcome. It was not diminished by partial success. It was not erased by failure. It was what they had done, and what they had done was worth doing. The parlour in the evenings received the same woman in all these cases before and after. Before, sitting with the weight of what she suspected and the anxiety of the unknown, and the long question of whether she was going to act. After, sitting with what she knew and what had been done and whatever the outcome had been. The fire in the grate was the same fire, the clock on the mantelpiece marked the same hours. What was different in the woman who sat in the chair was the quality of the sitting, the quality of someone who had decided and acted and lived with what the action produced. That quality, hard to name and real, was its own kind of victory. Act 14. The Quiet Revolution in the Ledger Books. By the first years of the 20th century, something had shifted in the way that the financial management of wealthy women's affairs was conducted in the cities of the American Northeast, and the shift was visible, to those who knew where to look, in the ledger books themselves. The shift was not dramatic. It was not proclaimed. It did not announce itself in the way that formal legal changes announce themselves, with specific dates and named statutes and the kind of official record that makes things easy to point to afterward. It was the kind of shift that shows up in patterns, in the accumulation of small data points that point consistently in the same direction. Trust administration, in the first decade of the 20th century, was beginning to look different from what it had looked like in the 1880s. Not everywhere, and not in all cases, but in enough cases, in enough places, that the difference was statistically visible to the people who track these things professionally. The fees that trustees charged had begun, in a number of jurisdictions, to be subject to more formal oversight. The reporting that trustees were required to provide to beneficiaries had become, in some courts' understanding of the fiduciary duty, more complete and more timely than it had been. The investment standards that trustees were expected to apply had been more precisely articulated in a number of court decisions that had been argued by lawyers who understood the practical problems the cases involved. These changes were small, and they were partial, and they could be reversed, and in some jurisdictions they were, but they were real, and they were the result of the accumulated weight of the cases that had been argued through the courts in the preceding 2 decades. The women who had commissioned the investigations and retained the lawyers and argued the cases had contributed to this shift in a way that was not credited to them in any public record. Their contributions were embedded in the precedents those cases had set, in the legal arguments those cases had established, in the practical understanding of what fiduciary duty required that had developed through the specific, documented, argued facts of those proceedings. The men who sat in the boardrooms of the trust companies in 1900 and 1910 were not, in general, aware that their somewhat changed practices in the administration of female beneficiaries' trusts were the result of a decade and more of legal pressure applied by women they did not know about. The practices had changed because the legal risk of certain kinds of administration had changed, and the legal risk had changed because courts had been presented with documented evidence of misconduct and had found that documented evidence sufficient to support legal remedies. The detectives who had gathered the documentation were not in the boardrooms either. Harrington, who had kept his private ledger for 20 years by this point, had a good working sense of the change he had been part of. He did not overstate it. The problems that had brought the women to his office in the 1880s were not solved. They were somewhat addressed in specific ways that made specific situations somewhat better than they had been. That was real. It was not the same as solved. Charlotte Vance, whose practice had grown over the years to include several other lawyers and a broader range of matters, had a similar assessment. She had been present at the shift in a more direct way than most, having argued cases that had contributed to it and having watched the doctrinal development that had resulted. She was neither naive about the limitations of what had been achieved, nor dismissive of the significance of what had been achieved. She held both things with the clarity that her professional training and her long experience had given her. The women who had been part of this, the women who had sat in the offices and read the reports and argued the cases and survived the proceedings, were largely invisible in any public account of it. Their contributions were private, processed through legal mechanisms whose public records documented the outcomes without identifying the people who had made those outcomes possible. A few were known within the network. Lavinia Whitmore's case was known to the lawyers who worked in this area, known as an example of what could be achieved with thorough documentation and capable representation. Eleanor Van Cortlandt's case was known to the network of women who had shared the informal information about how these things worked. But the names were not in newspapers, not in public records, not in the kind of account that would allow a later generation to find them easily. This is the nature of quiet revolutions. They happen in the spaces where the public record does not reach, in the private offices and the afternoon parlours, and the careful letters and the confidential reports, in the decisions made by people who do not announce their decisions and are not celebrated for making them. The ledger books, which are the record of how money moves and who controls it and what the terms of its management are, tell the story if you know how to read them. But ledger books are not the kind of record that gets preserved with the care given to more obviously historical documents. They get lost, they get discarded, they get catalogued in institutional archives under descriptions that do not convey what they contain. The women in this story are mostly not in the histories. The shift they contributed to is in the histories, attributed to the formal legal changes and the court decisions and the doctrinal developments, but not attributed to the specific, private individual decisions that are the actual mechanism by which legal change gets made. That is the nature of the contribution. It is real and it is unacknowledged, and both of these things are true at once. The ledger books, sitting in their archive boxes in the institutional records of the trust companies and the law firms and the courts that processed these cases, carry their stories without announcing them. The stories are in the patterns, in the accumulation of small adjustments and corrected accounts and revised fee structures and amended trust documents that represent, in the aggregate, the practical consequences of the decisions made by the women who hired the detectives. There is a sense in which everything described in this story is about inheritance, and it is worth spending some time in that idea before arriving at the end. The most obvious inheritance is the financial one, the specific documented sums that were at stake in these cases, the trusts and the estates and the fortunes that the women in these cases were trying to protect. This is what the cases were formally about. It is what the legal proceedings addressed. It is what the detective reports quantified. It is, in the most immediate and practical sense, what mattered. But there is another inheritance in the story, less obvious and in some ways more interesting, and it is the inheritance of watching. The women who hired the detectives were, as has been noted, women who had been paying attention to their situations for a long time before they acted on what they had observed. The attention was a skill, developed over years of living inside a world that required its female participants to be readers of social text, interpreters of the meanings behind the forms, attentive to the patterns in behaviour that conveyed information in a register that the official communications did not reach. This skill, the skill of reading what is not said alongside what is said, of attending to pattern rather than individual event, of maintaining over time the patient, systematic observation that allowed the significance of small things to accumulate into actionable knowledge, was not something these women had developed for the purpose of investigating their own families. They had developed it in the ordinary course of living inside the world they inhabited, because that world required it of them. What they did was apply it in a new direction. And what they learned, in applying it, was that watching was not merely a defensive skill, it was a generative one. The watching taught them things they had not known, and the things they learned changed what was possible. The legal structures they built, the estates they protected, the arrangements they negotiated, were all built on the foundation of specific knowledge that the watching had produced. And the watching itself as a practice was something that could be passed on. Harrington, in his private ledger, had noted the cases in which the client's daughter or niece had been part of the situation in some way, had been present at a consultation, or had been involved in the practical management of the legal response. He had noted in these cases the particular quality of attention that the younger woman brought, an attention that was already informed by what the older woman had done, and was, in some cases, considerably more prepared than the older woman's attention had been when she had first become aware of the problem. The knowledge was being transmitted, informally through the same channels that the network transmitted everything, but specifically and practically. The daughter who had watched her mother navigate a trust dispute in the 1890s, and had been told, in the way that Eleanor Van Cortlandt had told her daughter, "This is what it looks like and this is what you do about it," was a woman who would know, if the pattern repeated in her own life, that it was a pattern she recognised and that she was not facing alone. This transmission was not universal. Not every woman who navigated these situations had daughters who were present for the navigation. Not every mother had the forethought or the opportunity to document what she had done in the way that Eleanor Van Cortlandt had documented it. Not every family situation allowed for the kind of explicit conversation that the transmission required. But it happened often enough to matter, and it mattered in the specific way that practical knowledge always matters when it is transmitted. It reduced the time it took the next person to understand what they were facing. It reduced the fear that comes from not recognizing a pattern. It increased the effectiveness of the response. Charlotte Vance noted late in her career that the clients she was seeing in the first decade of the 20th century were, as a group, slightly better prepared than the clients she had seen in the 1880s and 1890s. Not dramatically better, slightly. They came with a slightly clearer understanding of what they were dealing with, a slightly more organised presentation of their concerns, a slightly more precise sense of what they needed from the legal process. She attributed this, in the account she wrote for herself and never published, to the fact that the information was travelling. The network had been operating for long enough, and enough cases had been processed through it, that the practical knowledge of how these situations worked and what could be done about them had accumulated into a body of understanding that was more available than it had been 20 years before. This was the other inheritance, not the money, not the legal precedents, but the knowledge. The knowledge of what it looks like, the knowledge of what to do, the knowledge that it can be done. These were things that had not been available to women of this class and era at the beginning of the period described in this story. They had become, gradually and through the specific work of specific people, somewhat more available by the end of it. That is not a complete victory. It is not a resolution. It is a change in the conditions under which the next person faced the situation, and that change was real and worth noting. The fire in the parlour burns down in every house, every night, without regard to what the women sitting beside it are thinking or planning or writing. The clock marks the hours, the letters are written and sent, the investigations are conducted and the reports are produced and the cases are argued and the outcomes are what they are. And the next generation watching learns. In the autumn of 1903, Harrington received a letter from a woman he would record in his files under the name Mrs. K. She was 67 years old. She had been a widow for 20 years. Her husband had been a man of some significance in the New York commercial world of the 1870s and 1880s, a man whose name had appeared in the newspapers in the way that the names of men of his kind appeared, in connection with business ventures and civic matters and the ordinary social and professional activities of the well-situated. He had left her well provided for. The estate had been structured with care, through a trust that had been designed, at the time of its creation, to ensure that her income was secure and that her access to it was not dependent on the continued goodwill of the male members of the family. The design had been, in its original form, a reasonable one. The implementation of it over 20 years of trust administration had drifted. She wrote clearly and carefully, as the women who wrote to him always did. She had, she said, been aware for some time that the administration of the trust was not entirely as it should be. She had raised her concerns with the trustees on several occasions over the preceding years, and had received responses that were reassuring without being specific, which was a thing she had learned to recognise as a particular kind of answer that was not an answer. She was writing now because something had changed. Her youngest daughter, the one she described as her most trusted companion, had recently begun spending time with two of the trust's administrators, meeting with them in circumstances that suggested a coordination that the daughter was not sharing with her mother. The meetings were not hidden, exactly, but they were not acknowledged either, and the space between not hidden and not acknowledged was one that Mrs. K had learned, over 20 years of managing complex family dynamics, to pay attention to. She wanted to know what her daughter was discussing with the trust's administrators. He received this letter on a Tuesday. He read it twice. Then he wrote back, as he always did, proposing a meeting. She arrived the following Thursday, punctually, and sat in the chair across the desk from him in the manner of someone who's been carrying a weight for some time, and who is not here to be consoled about the weight, but to do something specific about it. The conversation was careful and specific. He asked his questions, she answered them. By the end of the hour they had a clear understanding of what the investigation would consist of, and what it would cost, and what it might find, and what it might not. She paid the initial fee from her own account without intermediary. The investigation took 7 weeks. It found the following. The daughter, whose name was Anna, had been meeting with 2 of the 3 trustees, the younger men in the group, on 4 occasions over the preceding 2 months. The meetings had taken place at the office of one of the trustees, at an hour of the late morning when social visits would not have been expected, and when a professional purpose would have been assumed by anyone who noticed. The content of the meetings could not be directly established, but the investigation found circumstantial evidence of its nature in the form of documents that had been reviewed by the trustee's office during the period of the meetings, documents that included correspondence related to the trust's administration, and specifically documents that appeared to be related to the question of Mrs. K's ongoing capacity to serve as the trust's life beneficiary in the manner originally specified. The phrase ongoing capacity was one that appeared in trust documents when the question of a beneficiary's mental or physical fitness was at issue. It was the language of the system, the formal language through which the challenge to a woman's independence was initiated within the machinery of trust administration. Mrs. K received the investigation report on a Thursday afternoon, in the same season of the year in which these meetings had begun. She read it in the usual way, carefully, without asking questions until she had finished. Then she asked about Anna. What had Anna said? What had Anna known? What had Anna's role been in the initiation of this process? The investigation could not say with certainty what Anna had known or what her role had been in the initiation. What it could say was that Anna had participated in 4 meetings with the trustees that appeared to be related to the question of the trust's administration. Whether she had initiated those meetings or had been invited into them by the trustees, whether she had known in advance what direction they were heading, or had been guided into a position that suited others' purposes, the investigation could not determine. Mrs. K sat with this for a long time. She asked one more question. She asked whether the investigation had found any evidence that the trust's administration had been specifically problematic in ways that would justify the trustee's current interest in her capacity. It had not. The trust's administration had certain inefficiencies, certain areas where the management was less than optimally aligned with her interests, but nothing that rose to the level of documented misconduct and nothing that bore any apparent relationship to the question of her mental capacity, which was, from all the evidence available to the investigation, not in question. She closed the folder the report was in. She set it on the desk in front of her with a care that suggested she was being deliberate about the gesture. She said very quietly that she thought she understood what had happened. She did not explain what she meant. He did not ask. She retained Charlotte Vance, who had a referral for a lawyer in the appropriate jurisdiction the following week. The legal preparation proceeded in the way that these preparations proceeded: thorough documentation of her financial competence, a physician's assessment, the restructuring of the trust's governance to reduce the specific vulnerabilities the investigation had identified. Then she had a conversation with her daughter. The conversation was private. He knew it had happened because she told him, on a brief visit she made to the office some months later, that it had happened and that it had been difficult, and that she thought, as much as she could think such a thing, that it was possible to understand what had led Anna to the position she'd taken and to remain in some kind of relationship with the person who had taken it. He did not ask for details. She did not offer them. What she did offer at the end of the brief visit was this. She said she'd been afraid, when she first wrote the letter to him, that what she found would be something she could not come back from, that the specific knowledge of what was happening would close doors that the uncertainty, as painful as it was, had left open. She said what she'd found instead was that the knowledge, even the most difficult knowledge, was something she could hold, that the clarity of knowing, even knowing hard things, was something she had more capacity for than she had believed when she had been afraid of it, that the uncertainty had been its own kind of burden, and the specific knowledge, whatever it had cost, had relieved her of that burden. She thanked him. She left. He added the case to the private ledger. He wrote a brief note, not about the facts of the case, but about this last observation of hers, the observation about knowledge and fear and capacity. It was the kind of observation he collected in the private ledger, alongside the patterns and the methods, the things that these women said that stayed with him, and that told him something about the experience of the work from the other side of the desk. He had a great many of these observations by now, accumulated over 2 decades of practice. They filled the later pages of the private ledger with a density of insight that the early pages, which were more focused on the practical patterns, did not have. The private ledger was not a document he would show anyone. It was a document he had written for himself, in the way that people who do difficult and specific work over a long period write for themselves, to maintain the kind of understanding of what they are doing that gets lost if it is not deliberately preserved. He closed the ledger when Mrs. K's case was entered and sat for a moment in the office on Fulton Street, which had been his office for more than 20 years now, and which had the quality of a space that has been used for a long time for a specific purpose, the quality of accumulated presence. The street below was doing what the street did in the late afternoon of an autumn day in the first years of the 20th century, its vehicles and its people and its particular urban sounds, which had changed over the 20 years in ways he could enumerate. The motor cars among the carriages, the electric lights beginning to supplement the gas, the telephone wires added to the telegraph lines. Some things had changed, some things had not changed. The women who came to the office had, over 20 years, come for the same reason, because they needed to know what was happening to their financial interests and because knowing required assistance that the world they moved in was not providing. The reason had not changed. The world had changed somewhat in the ways described in the private ledger and in ways beyond it. but the fundamental situation, the gap between what the law provided on paper and what the social and institutional world provided in practice, was still there. Smaller, in some respects, still there. The next letter from the next woman in the next situation would arrive in the morning's post. He put the private ledger in the drawer, he put on his coat. He went home to the apartment on 23rd Street where his dinner was waiting, and he ate it, and he read the newspaper, and he went to bed. Outside, the city continued its life in all directions. Final act, the house at evening. There is a house. It is evening. The autumn has come far enough along that the trees in the garden have lost more than half their leaves, and the ones that remain are a dark gold that is almost brown, catching the last light of the afternoon as it comes through the garden's back wall in the long angled way of late October light. Inside the house, the fire has been lit in the parlour. It is new enough that it is still building, still finding its even rhythm, the flames active and bright before they settle into the steadier glow of a fire that has been burning for some time. The room smells of the wood smoke and of the particular smell of a house that is well maintained and well inhabited, the accumulated warmth of many years of fires in this grate, and many years of people moving through these rooms. The woman who lives in this house has been here for a long time, not all her life, but a significant portion of it, the portion that began with her marriage and continued after her husband's death, as the portion that belonged specifically to her. The house had been his first, and then theirs, and then, after the estate was settled and the arrangements were confirmed, hers. Hers in the specific legal sense, which was the sense that had required the most care, and hers in the larger sense, the sense of a place that has been inhabited long enough to have become part of the person who inhabits it. She's sitting in the chair beside the fire. She has a book on the table beside her, a book she's been reading for some weeks in the slow, unhurried way that she reads now, a few pages at a time, no longer driven by the need to finish things that had characterized her earlier decades. The book is good. She will finish it eventually. There is no particular reason to hurry. Outside the curtained window, the garden is settling into its evening. The birds that had been audible through the afternoon have found their roosting places and are quiet. The last of the light is going from the sky in the way it goes in October, quickly after the early sunset, the blue deepening and the horizon holding its long pale gold for a few minutes after the sun itself is gone. She thinks about the correspondence she received this morning, a letter from her niece, the younger daughter of her late sister, who is in a situation that the letter describes obliquely, but that she can read clearly enough, having seen the shape of it before. The niece needs guidance. The niece needs to know that the situation she is in has a shape and the shape can be navigated. The niece needs perhaps an introduction. She will write back tomorrow. She knows what to say. The fire has found its rhythm now, burning with the steady, even warmth that a good autumn fire in a well-built fireplace produces, the warmth that fills a room and softens its edges and makes the outside dark feel like a confirmation of the inside light rather than a threat to it. She picks up the book. She reads a few pages. The story in the book is about something that happened a long time ago somewhere far away, and it is a good story, and she follows it with the same patient, precise attention that she brings to everything. The clock on the mantelpiece marks the hour with its ordinary sound. The house is quiet around her, the quiet of a house that is well settled into its evening, every room at its appointed temperature, every lamp lit at its proper level, the servants in the kitchen at the end of their day, the whole establishment in the kind of order that it takes a long time and a specific kind of management to achieve. It is her house, in every sense of those two words. She did not come to this easily. She came to it through the specific, difficult, careful work of the years described in this story, through the investigations and the legal proceedings and the long, patient effort of understanding her own situation clearly enough to protect it. She came to it through the network that had told her what was possible, and through the lawyers who had made the possible actual, and through the detectives who had given her the information she needed to begin. She came to it through the specific, particular decision she had made on an autumn evening not unlike this one, when she had been sitting in a different parlour in a different house, with a piece of paper in front of her and a pen in her hand, deciding whether to do the thing that needed doing. She had decided yes. Everything had followed from that. She sets the book down. The fire is burning beautifully. The room is warm and quiet and entirely itself. She looks at the fire for a while, the way that people who are comfortable and at ease look at fires, not with attention, but with a kind of open, unfocused awareness that is its own form of rest. Then she picks up the book again and reads until the fire has burned a little lower, and the clock has marked another hour, and the autumn evening outside has become the autumn night, quiet and deep and full of the particular piece of a world that has settled into its dark. The niece's letter is on the desk. She'll write back tomorrow. She has things to tell her. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. What aspect of Gilded Age women's history do you find most fascinating? Were you surprised by how far these women went to protect their independence? Let us know in the comments. Act 17. The Philadelphia Sisters. There was a case in Philadelphia in the winter of 1895 that was notable not because it was unique, but because it involved two sisters who were, unusually, navigating the same situation simultaneously, and who were doing so together rather than separately. The sisters were named Catherine and Harriet Morse, and they were the daughters of a man who had made a considerable fortune in the dry goods trade in the decades following the Civil War, and who had died in 1891, leaving his estate divided between his two daughters and a charitable bequest to a hospital he had supported during his lifetime. The daughters' portions were held in separate trusts administered by the same board of trustees, a structure that had seemed, at the time of its creation, like an efficient consolidation, but that had turned out to have a specific practical disadvantage. The disadvantage was this: the same board of trustees, administering two trusts for two beneficiaries whose interests were not always perfectly aligned with each other's, was in a position where any decision that slightly favoured one trust's administration over the others was a decision that potentially served one sister at the expense of the other. The potential for this kind of tilt was inherent in the structure. Whether it was being exploited and in what direction was what the sisters wanted to know. They had come to the inquiry together, which was itself unusual. Most clients came alone or through an intermediary. The Morse sisters had discussed the situation between themselves over the course of a winter's worth of afternoon visits, had arrived at a shared assessment of the problem, and had decided to address it jointly. Catherine was the elder by 4 years, and she had the particular quality of directness that eldest children of certain families develop, the quality of someone who has been accustomed since childhood to speaking first and to having her speech received as the authoritative version of the family position. She was 43. She described the situation with precision and without unnecessary preamble. Harriet was quieter. She listened to her sister's description with the attention of someone who had heard it before, and was assessing whether it was accurate and complete. Occasionally she added a detail or a qualification. Once she gently corrected a date. Catherine accepted the correction without any visible friction. What the sisters had observed, independently and then together, was that the trust income paid to Catherine's account had been, over the preceding 3 years, consistently slightly higher than the income paid to Harriet's account, despite the fact that both trusts had been funded with equal principles and were invested, according to the trustees, in identical portfolios. The discrepancy was small in any given quarter. Taken together over 3 years, it amounted to something in the vicinity of several $1,000s. Small in the context of the trust's total value, but consistent, which was what made it not small. The investigation that followed was designed to address the specific question the sisters had posed. Was the discrepancy the result of genuinely differential investment performance, or was it the result of some other mechanism? What the investigation found was that the portfolios of the two trusts, which were represented to the sisters as identical, were not quite identical. The differences were technical and small, the kind of differences that could be presented as investment judgment calls rather than deliberate choices. But when the performance of the specific instruments in which the two trusts differed was analysed, the instruments in Catherine's trust had consistently outperformed the instruments in Harriet's, and the differential was not random. The trustees had been making small, technically defensible choices about the allocation of investments between the two trusts that consistently resulted in the better performing instruments being allocated to Catherine's trust. Why Catherine, rather than Harriet? The investigation could not determine this with certainty, but it noted that Catherine's late husband, who had died 3 years before, had been a business associate of the lead trustee. The social relationship between Catherine and the trustee was warmer than the relationship between Harriet and the trustee. The differential allocation might have been the product of nothing more deliberate than the ordinary human tendency to give slightly better service to the people you know and like better. Harriet received this information with a stillness that was not quite the same as equanimity, but that contained it. She asked several questions, all of which were specific and most of which were addressed by sections of the report she pointed to precisely. Catherine, receiving the same report, was notably less still. She was the one who had been favoured, and the knowledge of that sat differently in a person than the knowledge of having been disadvantaged. The two sisters left the office together and went to a tea room 2 streets away, where they sat for an hour and discussed what they had read. Their conversation, which Harrington of course was not party to, produced a resolution that Charlotte Vance, who handled the legal aspects of the matter, described afterward as unusually collaborative and unusually effective. The sisters had decided together that the appropriate response was not to address the differential management through formal legal proceedings, but to use the documented evidence of it as the basis for a restructuring of the trust's governance that would, going forward, prevent the same mechanism from operating. They wanted the trust to be managed by separate institutions, so that the single board's informal preferences could not be expressed through differential allocation between their accounts. They wanted the reporting requirements to include, explicitly, a comparison of the investment portfolios of the two trusts, so that any future divergence would be immediately visible, and they wanted the restructuring to be accomplished, if possible, through negotiation rather than litigation. The negotiation, which Vance conducted on behalf of both sisters, succeeded. The lead trustee, confronted with the documented analysis of the differential allocation and with the specific, legally well-founded request for restructuring, agreed to the proposed changes. The trust was separated to different institutional administrators. The reporting requirements were revised. The sisters signed the amended trust documents at the same table, on the same afternoon, with the same lawyer witnessing. After the signing, they had tea in a different tea room from the one they had used on the afternoon they had read the report, a tea room that had better cakes, which Harriet had been recommending to her sister for months. The small detail of the cakes was the kind of detail that did not appear in any legal document, and that is, perhaps, not the kind of detail that belongs in a narrative account of the legal and financial lives of Gilded Age women. But it is the kind of detail that makes a person real rather than a representative of a category, and the women in this story were real. They had tea. The cakes were, as Harriet had promised, very good. Some of the women in these cases left written records, not the legal records, which were produced by the proceedings themselves, but their own personal records, letters and journals and notes written for themselves or for the people they trusted most, in which they described their experiences in the unguarded register of private writing. These records are fragmentary. They were not kept with the intention of being preserved or studied. They survived by the various accidents that private documents survive by, which is to say, by being kept by people who thought them worth keeping, and by the chance circumstances that allowed them to be found later by people who understood what they were. What the fragments contain is something that the legal records do not contain, the texture of the experience from the inside. The legal records contain the facts. The investigation reports contain the evidence. The court documents contain the arguments and the outcomes. None of these documents contains what it felt like to sit in the chair in the parlour on an autumn evening and decide to write the letter. None of them contains what it felt like to read the report that confirmed what you had suspected for years. None of them contains what it felt like to walk into a courtroom and listen to someone argue, in the formal language of the law, that you were not competent to manage your own affairs. The private records contain some of this. A fragment of a letter, undated but written in the period of the 1890s by a woman whose identity remains unknown because the fragment was preserved without its address or signature, reads as follows. It was written to a friend. The investigators found what I was afraid they would find, and also found something I had not known to look for, which was worse. The first finding I had prepared myself for over the course of a long and not entirely comfortable year. The second I had not prepared for, because I had not known it was there. What it means to be prepared for one thing and not another is that you discover, in the moment of the unexpected finding, both what you're capable of and what you're not. I found that I was capable of a great deal. The thing I was not capable of was not being sad about it, and I have decided that this is appropriate rather than a weakness. The letter was written to a friend. It was read by the friend and kept by her, which means the friend valued it as worth keeping. It passed, at some point, through the ordinary mechanisms by which private documents are preserved or lost, into an archive where it was found by a researcher who recognized what it was and understood its significance. The researcher was not looking for this letter specifically. She was looking for something else and found this. She made a note of it and incorporated it into her own work, which was about women's economic history in the Gilded Age, a field that had been built in the preceding decades partly through the patient archival work of people who understood that the documents that would tell this story were not in the obvious places. Another fragment, this one from a journal kept by a woman named Ellen Prescott of Boston, is dated September of 1898. Ellen wrote, "I have been thinking about what patience means, not the patience that the world wants from me, which is the patience of waiting without acting, of accepting without questioning, of trusting the management of others without verification. That patience I have given, in the years before this one, in sufficient quantity to understand that it produces in me nothing useful and nothing good, only the particular quiet that comes from having suppressed a faculty over a long time until the suppression becomes habitual. What I mean by patience now is the other kind, the patience of watching and noting and waiting for the specific information that makes action appropriate and effective rather than premature and costly. This kind of patience is not the suppression of a faculty, but the exercise of one. I find it considerably easier than the first kind. I find it, in fact, almost natural, as though it is something I have always known how to do and have only recently understood that I have permission to do." Ellen Prescott continued her journal through the following years. The entries related to her financial situation become less frequent and, in tone, gradually more resolved, as the situation itself resolved through the legal processes she pursued. The later entries are about other things, her reading and her friendships and the particular observation of the natural world that occupied her, in her garden and on her walks, and in the general attentive way she moved through her life. She was a woman who paid attention. She paid attention to her financial situation when it required attention, with the same quality of careful, patient observation she brought to everything else. The journal is a record of a whole person's inner life, of which the legal and financial situation was one part, a significant part during its active years, but one part. This is worth remembering. The women in this story were not defined by their legal situations. They were people who had legal situations as part of their full, varied, complex lives. The legal situation was, during the years described here, an absorbing preoccupation that required the best of their intelligence and their nerve. But they were also reading books and tending gardens and maintaining friendships and observing the natural world and doing the 100 other things that constitute a life. The fragment of the letter from the unknown woman and the journal of Ellen Prescott are the kinds of records that remind you of this. That the legal and financial history is a part of the human story, not the whole of it, and that the human story was being lived fully and variously by the people inside it. By 1910, the world that had framed the cases described in this story was beginning to change in ways that are visible from a later vantage point, even when they were not always visible to the people living inside them. The suffrage movement, which had been building in strength and organisation through the preceding decades, was approaching the constitutional amendment that would eventually pass in 1920. The progressive era's reform energies were producing changes in the regulation of business and in the administration of law that had indirect effects on the conditions under which wealthy women's trusts were managed and their legal rights enforced. The professional world was opening slowly and unevenly to women, and the presence of more women lawyers and more women in financial services was beginning to create institutional knowledge in those fields that was more sympathetic to the specific situations described in this story. None of this was fast. None of it was uncontested. The world that existed in 1910 was still a world in which the fundamental asymmetry of male and female legal and financial status was the starting point for any specific situation. The changes were changes in the margin, in the degree to which the asymmetry could be challenged and corrected in specific cases, in the social and institutional support available to women who chose to make those challenges. The detective agencies that had been doing this work found their case volumes shifting. The specific cases involving trust misadministration and competency challenges did not disappear, but the context in which they occurred had changed enough to affect how they were handled and what the available legal and practical tools were. Harrington, who had been conducting this work since the 1880s, noted the change in his private ledger. He noted it without particular sentiment. Change had been happening all along, always partial and always contested, and this change was the same, real, incomplete, worth noting. The women who came to his office in the years after 1910 were in some ways different from the women who had come in the 1880s, and in some ways the same. Different, somewhat more likely to have had a lawyer before coming to him, to have already engaged some part of the legal process, to be coming to the investigation with a more specific evidentiary need, rather than the more general need for understanding that had characterized the earlier cases, somewhat more likely to have had prior exposure, through education or professional contact, to the specific legal mechanisms involved. Same, women with money at stake and families with interests opposed to theirs and the specific need to know what was happening in the spaces where they did not have access. Women who had been paying attention for a long time and who needed someone to confirm and extend what they had observed. Women who were capable and prepared and who required not reassurance but specific actionable information. He had been serving this specific need for more than 20 years. He expected to serve it for some years more. The world was changing, the need was not yet gone. The afternoon light in the office on Fulton Street came in at its October angle, long and gold and specific. It illuminated the desk and the chair and the shelves of case files and the private ledger in its drawer. It made the room look, for the particular minutes that the angle lasted, like something that had been considered rather than merely occupied, a room in which things had been done for a long time that mattered. Then the angle changed, as angles do, and the room was just the room again. He went back to the correspondence. The house on the November evening, a house that has appeared several times in this story, in various houses in various cities in the later decades of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, is always the same house in its essential quality. It is a house that is warm and lit against the dark outside. It has a fire in the parlour and the particular smell of a house that has been lived in for a long time, and the clock on the mantelpiece that marks the hours with its ordinary sound, and the curtains drawn against the evening. What changes from one evening to the next, from one house to the next, is the quality of the person sitting beside the fire. Before the letter is written, the quality is one of contained anxiety, of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time, and who has not yet found the specific action that would allow her to set it down. The room is beautiful, and she's comfortable in it, and underneath the comfort there is the weight. After the letter is written, the quality is different. Not lighter, exactly, because the weight is still there, the situation is still what it is, but different. The difference between uncertainty and the beginning of a process, the difference between waiting and acting, the difference between the fear of what you don't know and the more manageable fear of what you're finding out. After the report is received, the quality changes again. The weight is now specific. The anxiety has a shape. The fear has a name. These are not comfortable things to have, but they are more workable than their predecessors. You can do something with a fear that has a name. You can prepare a response to an anxiety that has a shape. After the legal proceeding, whatever its outcome, the quality is what it is. The quality of someone who has done the difficult thing and is living with what the doing of it produced. Not simple, not uncomplicated. The quality of a real outcome in a real life. The fire burns down. The clock marks the hour. The curtains move in the draught that has never been entirely identified. And the woman in the chair picks up the book she's been reading, or puts down the letter she's been composing, or simply sits and looks at the fire in the meditative way that people look at fires when they have been thinking about something for a long time and have arrived at last at a place of some peace with it. Outside, the city does its night business. Inside, the house is still. She has managed her situation. She has the information she needed. She has taken the action that the information made possible. The outcome is what it is, which is to say it is a real outcome, not a perfect one, not a simple one, but a real one. She has the house. In every sense of those 3 words. The fire burns steadily. The clock marks the late hour. The curtains are still. The house breathes its slow night breath, the accumulated warmth of many years settling into itself, the furniture and the carpets and the walls that have absorbed the presence of the person who has lived here for so long that the house and the person have become, in some way that is beyond the merely legal, the same thing. She is here. She has made herself here. The fire will burn down before morning. The light will come with the morning through the garden windows across the floors she's walked for years. The correspondence on the desk will be answered. Her niece will receive a letter. And the letter will say, this is what it looks like, and this is what you do about it, and you're not alone in knowing how. Sleep well. There is an hour, in the evenings in the large houses of the Gilded Age, that belongs to no particular obligation. It comes after the social engagements of the evening are concluded, and before the necessity of sleep, and it has a quality of freedom that is different from the earlier freedoms of the day, which were freedoms within the structured time of household management and social obligation. The freedom of this hour is the freedom of unstructured time, which is perhaps the rarest freedom available to a woman whose life is organised around the needs of others. The house is quiet. The obligations of the day have been discharged. The obligations of tomorrow have not yet begun. There is only this: the fire, the lamp, the book or the letter, or simply the thinking, and the specific quality of the night hour that belongs to itself. In this hour, in the households of the women described in this story, the particular work of survival happened. Not the dramatic work, not the legal filings or the confrontations or the courtroom arguments, the quieter work of understanding, of sitting with what was known and what was not yet known and what needed to be decided, of thinking through the steps with the patient attention that good thinking requires, of arriving at the clarity that makes action possible. The quality of this hour in the specific parlours of these specific women carries in this story because it is the quality that connects all the other hours. The fire in the grate is the fire that burned while Eleanor Van Cortlandt read the investigation report. The lamp on the desk is the lamp under which Lavinia Whitmore wrote her careful notes about the discrepancies she'd noticed in the trust's statements. The clock on the mantelpiece is the clock that marked the hour while Constance Harrowell sat waiting for the news about the hearing. All of these hours are the same hour, the hour of the fire and the lamp and the thinking, the hour before sleep in the houses where the work was done. And in each of these hours, the woman at the centre of it was doing what she had taught herself to do, what the situation had required her to learn, and what, in learning, she had discovered she'd always known how to do, paying attention, thinking clearly, deciding what mattered and what to do about it. The fire burns, the clock ticks, the night holds the house in its particular stillness. You are in this room too, in some sense, listening to the story of these women, in your own hour of the evening, in your own chair in the dark that surrounds the place where you are. The fire in their parlours is the warmth you are also feeling. The clock in their houses marks the same hours. The story is old and specific, and it belongs to a particular time and a particular world. But the quality of the hour in which it is told, the evening hour before sleep, the hour of settled warmth and quiet, is not old. It is the same hour it has always been. Rest in it. The women in the parlours rested in it too. After the letters were written and the reports were read and the decisions were made, after the legal proceedings were concluded and the outcomes were what they were, after the long years of paying attention and acting on what they observed. They sat in the parlours in the evenings and they rested. The fire gave its warmth, the house was still, the clock marked the hours toward morning. They had done what they could do, they had done it well. The rest was the rest of people who have worked hard at a difficult thing and have reached the end of what could be done tonight. Tomorrow there would be more. The niece's letter, the correspondence, the next thing and the thing after. But tonight, in the hour before sleep, in the warm and quiet house, there was this. Rest. The fire burns down. The lamp is low. The house is entirely still. Outside, the night does its long, patient work of being night. Inside, the woman in the chair closes her eyes. The clock marks the hour. Sleep comes gently. The way that sleep comes to people who have earned it. Act 26. The Archive of Small Things. The archive of this story is distributed and partial and in some cases nearly lost. It is not in one place. It is in the institutional records of the trust companies, and the law firms and the courts, in the case files that were retained and those that were not, in the private papers of the lawyers and the private papers of the clients, some of which survived and some of which were deliberately destroyed by families who did not want the history preserved, and some of which simply disappeared in the ordinary way that private papers disappear over a century. What has been retained is partial. This is not unusual for historical archives, especially for the records of private lives in a period before the systematic preservation of such material was understood as valuable. The records of the Gilded Age that have been most carefully preserved tend to be the records of the public and the prominent. The men whose business lives and public careers were documented in the commercial press and the political records and the institutional histories. The private lives of wealthy women, which is to say the lives that constitute the substance of this story, were not generally regarded as worth the effort of preservation. Some of it survived anyway. The legal records, even when the case files were lost, left traces in the court records that were, in many jurisdictions, better preserved. The financial records of the trust companies survived in the institutional archives, even when the trustees who had administered them were long forgotten. The private papers of Charlotte Vance survived in the collection of a university that recognized their historical significance. From these fragments, and from the fragments of private correspondence and private journals that survived in family collections and in the acquisitions of libraries and archives that were assembling records of women's history, a picture can be constructed. Not a complete picture, a picture with gaps, some of which can be inferred across and some of which cannot. The gaps themselves are part of the historical record. The places where the archive is thin are often the places where the women being described were most successful at the strategic privacy that was part of their method. They conducted their most sensitive business in ways that did not leave the kind of records that could be found by people looking in the wrong places. The thinness of the archive in certain areas is, if you know what you're looking at, evidence of exactly the strategic discretion that the story describes. In the small hours of the morning, in the house where the fire has burned down and the lamp has been turned down, and the household is entirely at rest, the woman who has been the centre of this story is asleep. The documents that will be produced in her case, the investigation report and the legal filings and the court order and the amended trust documents, will be produced in the weeks and months ahead. Some of them will survive, some will not. The fragments that remain will tell part of the story to people who read them 100 years later. But the most important part of the story, the specific private quality of what it was to be this person in this situation and to have made the decision she made, is not fully in any document. It is in the quality of what these rooms contained, in the warmth of the fire and the steady ticking of the clock and the particular autumn smell of the curtained house at night. It is in the very specific peace of a person who has decided to act, who has found the right tools, who has done the difficult work and who is resting now in the settled confidence of having done what could be done. That quality is the archive that does not fit in a box. It is in the story itself. The evening always becomes morning eventually. That is one of the things about evenings. The fire burns down to ash, which is cold by the time the household begins to stir, and the lamps are out, and the house in the early morning has a different quality from the house at night, the quality of a space that has been empty of human presence for several hours, and that is beginning, with the arrival of the first servants in the kitchen, to warm itself back into the inhabited version. The light comes into the garden through the east-facing windows first, grey before it is golden, the particular early light that is the absence of night more than the presence of day. The birds begin in the garden, the small urban birds that have their territories in the larger gardens and the trees of the streets around the house, the sparrows and the finches and the pigeons, beginning their morning conversations in the branches outside the bedroom window. The woman in the bedroom is in the last stages of sleep. The deep sleep of the hours between 2 and 5 has given way to the lighter sleep of early morning, the sleep in which the mind begins to move again, not with the full purposefulness of waking, but with the exploratory associative quality of the transition between sleep and consciousness. In this transition, the events of the preceding days are present but not yet organised, held in the mind in the way that important things are held when the waking mind has not yet taken them up and arranged them in their proper order. The investigation report she read yesterday, the conversation with the lawyer, the decisions that have been made and the decisions that are still to be made. They are all there in the early morning light, waiting for the day. The morning has a particular quality in these houses in October. The house is cold at this hour, before the fires have been built up and the central heating, if the house has it by now, has had time to work. The cold is the ordinary cold of a house that has been without heat for several hours, and it has a kind of clarifying quality, a sharpness that makes the transition into full waking easier than the warmth of a well-heated room would. The water in the pitcher on the washstand is cold too, and washing in it is the kind of purposeful small discomfort that marks the beginning of the day with a specific physical awareness. The clothes for the day are laid out by the maid, who has been in the room quietly while the waking has been happening. The day's first cup of tea arrives, hot and strong, in the particular cup that is always this cup at this hour. Outside the window, the garden is doing its October morning thing, the frost on the grass melting in the early light, the last leaves coming off the trees in the slight movement of the morning air, the birds still working through their morning declarations. The day begins. The letter to the niece will be written before breakfast or after, according to the household's rhythms. The correspondence with the lawyer will continue. The management of the estate will proceed according to its own schedule. The social obligations of the day will be met with the particular quality of presence and composure that this woman has always brought to them. And underneath all of it, the specific private knowledge of what has been done and what it has made possible, the settled piece of a situation that has been handled, as well as a situation of this kind can be handled, the particular clarity of knowing what you know and having done what could be done with what you know. The morning light fills the room. The day is beginning. The life continues, as it has continued, as it will continue. Hers? There is a weight to knowledge that is different from the weight of ignorance, and the difference is worth attending to carefully, because the two things are often confused. The weight of ignorance is diffuse. It is the weight of not knowing what is wrong, of sensing that something is out of alignment without being able to name it, of living with the anxiety that floats free of any specific object, because the specific object has not yet been identified. The anxiety of ignorance is exhausting in the way that undefined threats are more exhausting than defined ones, because the mind cannot close around an undefined threat, and so it cannot put it down. The weight of knowledge is different. It is heavier in one sense because what you now know has a specific gravity, a specific reality that the undefined anxiety did not have. You know what is happening to your trust. You know what the legal mechanisms are. You know what the specific acts of misconduct were. The knowledge is heavier than the suspicion. But it is more bearable. The knowledge can be picked up and examined and put down again. It can be taken to a lawyer who can do something specific with it. It can be converted into action, into the specific legal and practical responses that the situation requires. The knowledge does not float free. It has edges and it has handles and it can be worked with. This is what the women in these cases learned, and what the network transmitted, and what the preventive assessments tried to convey in advance. That the knowledge, however hard it was more manageable than the not knowing. That the specific fear was less debilitating than the diffuse one. That the clarity, even when the clarity was painful, gave you back the capacity to act that the uncertainty took away. Eleanor Van Cortlandt had known this, or discovered it, in the autumn of 1893 when the investigation report told her specifically what her son William had been doing. The knowledge of the specific was harder than the general suspicion had been, and it was also, immediately, more workable. She had known what to do with the specific. The specific had pointed directly to the preparations required. Lavinia Whitmore had known it too, across the long years of gradual, patient inquiry that had led eventually to the documentation of Ashby's mismanagement. The clarity of the documented evidence, when it finally arrived, had the quality of a weight that was heavy and handleable simultaneously. The clarity is the gift, not a painless gift, not a gift that the recipient would always have chosen if she had known in advance what it would cost, but a real gift, the gift of seeing what was actually there, of being able to stand in accurate relationship to her own situation, of having the specific truth of her circumstances rather than the managed version she had been offered. The woman in the parlour on the evening when she writes the letter is about to receive this gift. She does not fully know this yet. She knows that she is taking an action she has been building toward for a long time, and she knows that the action is going to produce information, and she knows in the general way that the information will change things. She does not know yet exactly how much it will change things, or in what specific ways, or what the specific weight of the specific knowledge is going to feel like when it arrives. She will know when it arrives. For now, she picks up the pen. The fire is burning, the clock is ticking, the night outside the curtained window is doing what the night does. She writes the address at the top of the page, then the date, then the salutation, then the beginning of the words that have been accumulating in her for a long time and that are at last finding their way to paper. This is how it begins. This is how it always begins. With a woman in a chair by a fire and a pen in her hand, and the particular courage of someone who has decided that knowing is better than not knowing, whatever the knowing costs. The fire gives its warmth. The pen moves across the page. The night holds the house in its patient quiet. She writes. The letter is finished. She folds it once, then again. The envelope is already addressed in the careful hand she uses for correspondence that matters. She seals it with the wax she keeps in the desk drawer for exactly this purpose, pressing her seal into it while it's still warm, the small circle of her initials pressed into the dark wax. She sets it on the silver tray. Then she sits back in the chair and looks at the fire for a long moment. The fire is at the stage she has been watching for an hour, the stage past the active burning and past the high coals, the stage where the heat is banked and even and deep, where it will hold through the rest of the night without tending. The light it gives is amber and still and entirely sufficient for sitting. She is not reading. She is not writing. She is simply sitting with the specific quality of having done a thing, the particular piece of action that has been too long deferred and is now at last begun. The clock marks the quarter hour. The house breathes around her in its slow, settled way. Somewhere in the house something settles with a small sound, the specific sound of a house that is entirely at rest. Outside, the city is doing its late-night business, reduced to the quieter traffic of the small hours, the occasional carriage, the distant sound of a night watchman. The sounds come muffled through the curtains, present enough to remind her that the world is there, distant enough to leave the room entirely to itself. She will sleep well tonight. She has not slept well in some time, the particular broken sleep of someone carrying a weight they cannot put down. Tonight the weight is still there, but it has changed its character. It is now the weight of something in progress, something that has been set in motion and that will, in the days and weeks ahead, move toward its resolution. She can put it down now, not because it is resolved, but because it is begun. She reaches over and turns down the lamp. The room deepens into the amber firelight. She closes her eyes. The house is quiet all the way to its foundations. Sleep comes. The morning will come with its light and its specific demands and its continuation of the story that has been set in motion tonight. The letter on the hall table will leave the house with the morning's correspondence. The detective agency will receive it. The investigation will begin. But that is the morning. That is tomorrow. Tonight is tonight. The long, deep, quiet tonight of a house at peace, and a woman at rest and a fire that has done its evening's work and is settling now into its coals. The story is still going. It will be going for some time yet, through all the stages described in what you've been listening to, the reports and the preparations and the legal proceedings and the outcomes that are what they are, which is to say real outcomes in a real life. But tonight, in this room, on this evening, in this particular hour that belongs to the space between the action taken and the consequences arriving, there is only this. The warm room, the quiet house, the settled fire. Rest. Good night. The fire is warm. The house is yours. The night holds you. The morning is still hours away, and when it comes, it will come with its own qualities, its particular light and its first sounds, and its gradual return of the world from the specific absence that night represents. But morning is not now. Now is this, the deep and settled quiet of the late hours, the warmth of the room, the particular peace of a person who has done what she decided to do, and who is resting in the specific, earned quiet of having decided and acted. The curtains are drawn. The fire is warm. The clock will mark the hours all night long, steadily and without urgency, the way time moves when no one is asking anything of it. You do not need to be anywhere. You do not need to do anything. The night is long and generous and entirely yours. Let the warmth of the room hold you. Let the quiet of the house settle around you. Let the breath come and go, slow and easy, the breath of someone at rest in a warm room in the late hours. The story has been told. The houses are quiet. The women who lived in them have done their work and found their rest. Sleep. The night is deep. The fire has given everything it had to give this evening and is now resting in its coals, warm still, giving off the last of its heat into the room in the slow, diffusing way of something that has done its work. Outside, the trees in the garden are bare or nearly bare, and the sky above them is the particular dark of a clear night in October, with the stars doing their ordinary brilliant work of being stars, cold and remote and indifferent in the best sense, the sense of things that continue their existence without requiring anything from you. In all the houses of all these stories, in all the cities and all the seasons and all the years of this long account, the same fire was burning, and the same night was holding the houses, and the same women were resting in the same specific peace of having done what they decided to do. That is the inheritance they share across the decades of this account. Not just the legal precedents, and the network knowledge, and the practical wisdom about how these situations work, but this. The knowledge that a person who decides to act has access to a kind of rest that is not available any other way. The rest that comes after action, the deep quiet of the settled decision. It is available to you now. The warmth of the room is yours. The quiet of the house is yours. The long, patient night is yours. Rest in it. Sleep comes to the person who has earned it. Good night. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us keep making more. See you in the next one.